We've got a very full program, so while there's still some more people to come, and it's important we make a start. So I'm Bruce Mullen, and I was going to say a few words at the beginning before I hand over to Mandy to chair this morning's session. I don't have to tell you that it's tough out there, very dry season. I've been talking to a few this morning and yesterday about the situation, and I guess when that happens, people really need to make the best decisions possible and at the right time. And often I think it's difficult for people when you're in that situation to make that decision on your own. So I think it's so important that people talk to others. And today the focus is not just on talking to farmers, but on to agribusiness. So everybody's got a role to play in terms of getting the message out and supporting sheep farmers to make the best decision possible for now and for the future. So this is the third meeting. There's been a meeting down in Kojonup. I think there's about 20 there. There's about 10 in Geraldton yesterday. And this meeting is being broadcast to our district offices, and there's a number of people, both Department of Agriculture and industry people at those locations. So Northam, Esperance, Katanning, Narrogin and Albany. Just looking down the program, and I thought one of the things that's particularly good about the program, I think, is the focus towards the end about people and money. We often think about we talk about sheep and how to feed them and when to sell them, etc. But I think we all know people who have lost through suicide, and I particularly like the Wheatbelt Men's Health talking towards the end about the human health factor, which I think is really, really important. And it's not just men, it's partners as well, so it's men and women, because they're all tied up in this. So I think that's probably my final comment, Mandy, is I think during these times we've got to look after each other, because it's tough, and it's hard enough looking after the sheep, but make sure we look after each other. So enjoy the morning, and as I say, be prepared to help others by passing on the messages. Thanks. All the best.
Okay. Well, let's get started with the program. And first up, sorry, I've just got to know what I'm pressing up here. First up, we've got Ashley Herbert, and Ashley is an experienced sheep specialist consultant and a general mixed enterprise consultant who's done a lot of work right across the state. And Ashley's going to talk about the strategies and tactics that are important for this season. So I'd like to welcome him up.
Today, I've tailored the presentation to address agribusiness people. So I can see a few farmers here, and I'm sure there's a few out in the other areas. But hopefully I can bridge between the two of them. But it's really talking to agribusiness people. And look, if there's any questions as I go, if you want any clarification, just put your hand up. People out in the offices there, I don't know how you do that, but I'll keep an eye on the screen maybe. What I want to make the point was that this presentation is a bit of a team effort between myself and Ed Riggle. Just on the first slide there, I had Ed's name and his logo, so just to acknowledge this is not just me, it's Ed Riggle as well. Ed presented down at Albany, but between the two of us, we've sort of put the thing together. Okay, now, I understand in some areas of the state, it's not just a poor year, it's quite severe. You'll see later from the Pastures in Space people just the extent and severity of how bad it is in some of those areas. So I acknowledge it's not just a poor year for a large area, but there is quite severe conditions in the north and east of the wheat belt. But I just want to make the point, this is what we say to clients, is that a poor season doesn't happen overnight, it's quite an incremental process, and the real problem with that is you don't just wake up one day and think, oh gee, it's not good. It often creeps up on you, and people sort of go through the phase of just thinking it's going to rain, hoping it's going to rain, waiting and waiting and waiting. And then at some stage it becomes blatantly obvious that things aren't going very well and decisions need to be made. The issue is the timing of that's very important to the options that you've got and how effective those options can be employed. And the real risk I see with people is they just not procrastinate, but the decisions become too big and too hard, and they leave it longer and longer and longer until they're left with two options, potentially, both of them very unpalatable and potentially quite expensive, and it's very difficult to make decisions in that environment. So one thing we reiterate all the time is it's important to have some sort of cues that alert you that decisions need to be made. Look, things aren't going well. It's the end of May, it hasn't rained. What does that mean really? It's the first week of June, it hasn't rained. What does that mean? To keep people on track with making decisions and keeping their options open and choosing options at the best time when those options can add value to the business. So that's the sort of key message that we generally trot out in a season like this. It's about just being proactive and be decisive. Now with sheep, there's really two decisions that you need to make. Do I need to increase carrying capacity? So do I need to produce more feed for my sheep to carry the sheep that I have, or do I need to simply reduce demand? So whatever decisions we make with sheep fall into those two categories. And it's important to recognise what phase am I in? Am I simply just trying to carry the sheep that I've got, or have I got to the phase where I need to reduce demand? Because there's key decisions that go along with those two components. Now typically, increase carrying capacity, we do it all the time. Every year we start feeding sheep. Now some years we feed a bit earlier, a bit longer, a bit more than others. Typically we might reduce crop, increase pasture area. These are all things that are designed around just carrying what we've got. And then we go down to simply just offloading sheep to reduce the overall feed demand. Adjusting and early stock sales. It's just all about less mouths to feed, less cost. Let's just make do with a core group of sheep. Now at the moment for a lot of areas, I think we're way past this. This is not working. We're way past this increased carrying capacity phase. From most of the areas I expect we're in this trying to rationalise demand. And today, myself and John will go through trying to prioritise where do we start that process and where do we stop, if in fact do we stop. But the idea is to give you some guidelines to help when you talk to your clients and for the farmers in the audience, when you're making these decisions, what's the framework to help make those decisions in a rational and objective way. Now, part of the program is it really helps with sheep to have what we call an exit strategy. So it's just basically a pre-planned structure as to how we're going to manage seasons as they come. Now, this is what we call an exit strategy. I guess we invented it, for the want of a better word, through the program called the Sheep's Back some years ago. And the whole idea is it's to give people confidence to lift their stocking rate, knowing that if the season's not going with them, there's an orderly, thought-out plan to back out of the season and keep things in control. Now, what we've got here is, this is tricky. Okay, this is the date of the break. Now, in this example, if it rains, if the season breaks on the 1st of May, the carrying capacity for this farm's 11 DSE, but they're only stocked to carry 8. Right? So they're potentially understocked for a 1st of May break, but that's not the issue here. It's not until we get to, say, the 28th of May break that you can see the carrying capacity of the farm is below the stock that we're carrying. So there's a 1 DSE deficit in carrying capacity. So what do? We just buy some feed. That's quite normal. There's nothing unusual about that. Just buy another load of lupins. That's increased the carrying capacity by 500 DSE, and that's fixed that. But if it doesn't rain until the 4th of June, carrying capacity of the farm's down to 6 DSE. So there's a 2 DSE deficit. We start to sell some sheep. So we're reducing demand. And if it gets down to the 18th of June, we've reduced our stocking rate to 5 DSE, but there's still a deficit of 1 DSE in carrying capacity. We're looking at buying some more feed. So this is just an orderly plan as to how we might manage the season as it unfolds. And what we find is that when this plan is developed in a before we get into this sort of situation, it's usually a little bit more well thought out and people have something to work to. It keeps people in control and gives them confidence that things are manageable, okay? So I think obviously 18th of June, we're way past that. But that's just to give you some flavour as to how we as sheep consultants sort of handle these sort of poor seasons to late breaks. Okay, now, bearing in mind some areas probably won't have a spring, the implications of a poor spring is that it really reduces the cheap feed that we normally fatten our sheep on. So normally in the spring, it's when we put condition back on our ewes, we grow our lambs, we get things ready for the summer, for sale, and with the ewes, we get them ready for joining for next year. Now, anything that affects our spring has a huge effect on the condition of our sheep going into summer. So that's probably the first implication for the future of the current season. And I think that's something important to remember, that it's quite likely in most areas of the state we'll have a very reduced spring flush, which feeds into sheep live weight gain either for lambs, adult sheep, which then affects carrying capacity and live weight performance through summer. Now I think it's important to recognise that when things aren't going well, there's this phase that people go through. You know, initially when it's not raining, we're hoping it's going to rain next week. There's a bit of worry when it's getting later, and then we get to mad panic in some degrees. When it hasn't rained, it's June, what do? Now, this is all normal, and I think it's important to let clients go through that phase, but I think it's useful just to recognise that this is quite a normal sort of process, but the trick is to get from this worry panic phase to decisions and actions. So let yourself go through it, but then it's important to go quickly from panic, okay, we've got to make decisions, we've got to do something. Because procrastination is just a disaster. Nothing benefits from doing nothing. Any decision is better than no decision in situations like this, no question. So what we say to clients is simply work to a plan. Now the exit strategy is a plan. Other people may have a different plan, but have a plan and work to it with discipline. You can change the plan, but you must have a plan. Otherwise, you just... otherwise what, Mandy? Thank you, yes. Okay, now it's important to understand where you are physically. What have you got in terms of grain? What have you got in terms of sheep, infrastructure, water, people? What have I got? What can I manage? And importantly, how much cash have I got access to? Money in the bank or bank finance? Because that provides some constraints on what your options might be and what you can do and what your time frame is. If you don't have much money or access to cash, working capital, you've got real time constraints and you've got to be pretty nimble on your feet and make good decisions quickly. If you're pretty well financed, you've got lots of options and a very long time frame, and it's useful to recognise that. And I guess emotionally, this is a tricky one because it's normal to be stressed in these sort of times, but when the stress is affecting your decision making, that creates problems for the business and yourself. Now, the problem is with this is typically the people in that position aren't the ones who can do anything about it. So it's relying on people around them to help them make decisions. So when we're talking to clients, often I come in and I just sit them down and we just add a bit of structure to their decision-making process. And that's often all it takes, is to say, look, we've got to make some decisions. These are the options. How about we work to this plan? And often that's enough to get them back on track. But it's not much value to them saying, look, mate, you've got to take control. Because if they're in that position, they're not in a position to do that on their own. So they need help. I think that's my message there. Now, it's very important when we're in these sort of conditions to be objective as possible, because we need decisions with clarity and we need decisions based on fact and objective. Emotional, subjective decisions have a real risk of being inappropriate. Intuition, gut feel is quite relevant, but we've got to be careful we've got to be careful to be objective wherever possible. Now, good decisions, bad decisions, wrong decisions, right decisions. What do I mean by that? Look, good decisions relates to what's a good decision for me and my business today, tomorrow, next year. What makes good business sense? Now, when I'm talking wrong or right, I'm sort of thinking that's more of a punt. You know, I'm having a guess, I'm taking a chance. Okay, I reckon if it rains in spring, I can do this today. That's great, but what if it doesn't rain in spring? What's the downside? A good decision is, okay, it might rain in spring, but it might not. And if it doesn't, this is the consequence for me and my business. That's not going to be good. So a good decision is to do something that mitigates that risk. And if it does rain in spring, well, that's great, but you've still made a good decision to mitigate the risk to your business. Taking a punt, I guess the point I'm making is it's fine to take a punt or to take a chance on something, but if you can't wear the risk of it not paying off, that's a bad decision for your business. If it turns out, great. If it doesn't, look out. So I think it's important to categorise decisions. Is this a good, bad decision, or is it wrong, right? Because that puts you in the framework as to good business decisions, having a punt. Now, there's nothing wrong with having a punt, but just be conscious that's what you're doing. Because if it doesn't pay off and you're not prepared for the downside, it's potentially quite bad for your business and yourself, quite likely. Okay, so what I'm saying to clients is we want to focus on the next 2 or 3 months. Now, if we try and focus on the next 6 months, there's just too many variables at play that we can't pin down to be able to make good decisions at the moment. So let's just keep our time frame short, and when we get to sort of September, late August, we've got more information, we can then make decisions for the next 2 or 3 months after that. But at the same time, we need to have a view on, okay, what could happen in 6 months? Best case, worst case, most likely. So it's great to have a view as to what could happen, but in our day-to-day planning, I think it's more appropriate to focus on the next 2 or 3 months because we know with a bit of certainty what's likely to happen given what's going on today. And it's really important to stay in control. And this is where people like us dealing with farmers, if we see people floundering a bit, it's important to try and get them back on track because they can't function if they're not in control. And if you can't do anything for them, it'd be handy to find someone who might be able to. Saying to them, mate, you got to get back on track, that's probably not going to be enough for some people. And look, at the end of the day, we're probably in a position where we're just trying to minimise loss. It's not about profit, it's about trying to shut the business down as best we can and cap the loss as best we can, which means cost control on all levels. It's not one particular thing, it's just cost control across the board to try and minimise that loss. So the questions we're asking the clients is simply, have you got a plan? What's your plan? If you don't have a plan, let's put one down. Let's get one organised. What's the worst case you can think of? And I'll tell you what, people can be pretty pessimistic when they want to be. But what do we think's most likely? Because I think that's really the path we try and tread. What's most likely with an eye on what's potentially the worst we can expect. Just consider the risks that you think are rational. And most importantly, I think, get a grip on the cash flow. How much cash have we got? Because that really gives us options and time frame. It's very important. Now, budgeting's super important, I think, because it gives us a sense of control. It helps us stay objective about what's really going to happen, and it helps capture a firm view on our cash flow and a capacity to take advantage of various options. But to make that useful, we've got to monitor the budget closely. So month to month, budget to actual, so we know exactly where we're going. If we're overspending or underspending, it's quite clear. And it helps keep us in tune with our cash capabilities. You know, what operating capital have we got access to? But most importantly, I think it just helps keep people having a sense of control, that we know what's going on, this is what we can do. How are we going for time, Mandy? Beauty, thank you. Okay, so look, in summary, it's just about making good decisions. In times of crisis like this, it's good decisions that get us through. It's minimising the loss, and we do that through making good decisions. It's fine to take a punt, have a guess, but you need to do that objectively and be really cognizant of what the real risk is if it doesn't pay off, and can I handle that? Because if the answer is no, you have to revert to another option, because if you can't handle the downside of that decision, it's potentially bad for your business, and we need to stay out of that sort of area. So while I'm suggesting we just focus on the next 2 or 3 months, we still need to have a view for what might be the worst outcome. Any questions on that? Any questions from the regions? Lane? Bat on, she said. Okay. Okay, now what I'll do now is really go into the feeding of sheep. But what I want to start with is just give you some sense of why we might even bother keeping sheep, right? Because I think this is a very important sort of component of the decision. Why would you bother keeping sheep when it all seems expensive and hard? Now this is a historical perspective on sheep profitability going back to 1984. It's expressed as dollars of operating profit per DSE. Here's 1984, and it's up to 2016. Now, last year, the average profit for my clients, the people I deal with, was about $48 a DSE. Now, that's operating profit. So from that, we pay interest, drawings, tax, overheads like shire rates, insurances, and those sort of things. So there's a component of depreciation in that profit of $48. So it's an operating profit. Now, if you think back, if you're old enough to remember, this is the late 80s boom in wool. 1987 to 1989. So you can see to today, in nominal terms, is faring a lot better even back in the boom. But look, if we correct for CPI, we can see that today's profitability in sheep is very close to what it was in the late 80s. So there is a real boom in profit in sheep, and it is substantially higher than it has been. So there's nearly $50 a DSE of profit last year. Now it'll be a lot less, it'll be a bit less this year because of seasonal reasons, but I think the fundamentals for sheep profitability are very strong. So there's no reason to expect it's going to come crashing down around our ears anytime soon. I'm not predicting it's going to be as good as it is, but the fundamentals are quite strong in that sheep profit will remain high. So there's good reason to think the future value of sheep is going to remain high. So there's good reason to keep sheep in the farm business. Now, part of that decision, I believe, is that you need to look at the sheep in the context of your farm operation and your farm business. What value do the sheep bring to your farm business? Do they have a lot of value? Is there a strong role for the sheep in your farm operation? Or are they a bit more of a hobby, superficial value? Because if they have a strong role, a lot of value, then that makes it more important to try and hang on to as many sheep as you can to get them into next year and the year after. If they don't have a lot of value, then it's a much easier decision to make whether I carry them or not carry them. Because to carry sheep through potentially a spring that you don't have, it's a lot of work, a fair bit of money, and there are risks. So I think it's important to really come to grips with, why have I got sheep? What value do they bring to me in my business, really? For a lot of people I deal with, they're mixed farmers truly, 50 to 60% of the farm's crop. Sheep have a real strong role to play and a lot of value. So keeping sheep for as long as we can adds real strength to our business and value. But the point about these graphs is just to demonstrate, look, that sheep are very, very profitable in a historical context. Now, when we're feeding sheep, it's very simple, particularly at the moment. It's all about energy. All we're trying to do is get energy down the throats of our sheep. Protein's important to a limited extent. Now, there are some sheep like weaners that need a bit more protein than others, but when we're looking at buying feed, feeding sheep, it's all about how much energy can we get down that sheep's throat. That's the big one. So when we're talking about comparing feed sources, it's about cents per megajoule of energy down their throat with a bit of protein. Now, minerals, I've minimised minerals because from a supplementary feeding perspective, generally we don't need to worry too much about minerals. It's not a big part of the equation. So we shouldn't get distracted by whether they've got stock licks or whatever. It's not really an issue. particularly if you're feeding lupins. Any vets got any? No, good. Danny's nodding. Good. Now look, with the sheep, they obviously, different classes of sheep have different requirements for energy. Andy, this is driving me bonkers. That's all right, I've got it. Thanks, sorry. Okay, now adult dry sheep, in terms of maintenance, so they're not losing or gaining weight, 6 to 8 megajoules is the normal range in energy requirements for an adult sheep. Now for most wheat belt type sheep, it's probably closer to 8 megajoules, because generally they tend to be bigger, right? And in the summer, the maintenance energy requirement's a bit less because there's less going on with the sheep. And the environmental conditions are a bit more mild. When it kicks into a bit wet and cold, the maintenance requirement does go up a reasonable amount. But we generally work on around 8 to 8.5 megajoules for a dry adult sheep. Obviously when they're joined and lactating, they need a lot more energy because there's a fair bit more going on with those sheep. Now look, this is the protein. Dry sheep maintaining energy only need a small amount of protein. Now most grain, even oats, would have 8% protein. So we don't need to worry about protein for adult sheep particularly, because it doesn't really add any value to them. Weaners are the ones that need a reasonable amount of protein in the diet, and that's simply because they're growing. They have a strong growth requirement that they can't shut off. You can't stop weaners from growing. If you don't feed them enough protein, they just don't. The frame grows, but the muscle tissue doesn't, and they just get skinnier, and eventually they end up falling off the perch. So weaners have a real need for protein, and it's around 14%, and that's relatively easy to provide. In addition to all that, we also know that the energy range of grain varies considerably. Now this is just simply a typical range of energy, megajoules of energy per kilo for each of the grains that we normally feed sheep. So oats, 8 to 11, that's quite normal to see that level of range of energy. So when we're feeding oats, depending on what we've got, to maintain a dry animal, you can eat anything from 500 grams to a kilo. So there's a twofold variation purely driven by grain quality. So if we're looking at buying grain particularly, what's the one thing we need to know, ideally? It's the energy content, because we're buying energy, that's what we're buying. Now when you're buying grain out of Elders, wherever you buy it from, no one's going to have the energy values. But it's very useful information to have. Now lupins typically vary a lot less. They tend to be quite consistent, very high energy, very high protein. It does vary, but nothing like it varies with oats. You can see here 400 to 600 grams a head a day will maintain an adult sheep usually. And from my experience, that's generally true. And you can see the protein content, but generally we don't have trouble getting 8% protein in the diet for sheep. Now I think the point, sorry, I'm just deciding, I think I'll address that now. The point I was going to make here was, look, in my mind, you can put a 50% premium per megajoule of energy on lupins over cereals when you're feeding sheep. And why I say that is that the wastage for feeding oats and barley and wheat, I think, is around 20%. So when you put it on the ground, I reckon you'd lose 15% easily, if not 20% of the grain doesn't get eaten because it's mixed into dirt. We generally find you get nearly 100% utilisation of lupins. Now remember, it's all about energy down the sheep's throat. So if you've only got barley and oats on hand, that's fine, but when you go to the market to buy grain, what I'm suggesting is that if lupins are 3 cents a megajoule and barley's 2.5 cents a megajoule, I would go the lupins all the time, because I think that represents better value to your sheep, to your business. The other issue is with barley and wheat particularly, when you're feeding high volumes, like 700-800 grams a head a day, grain poisoning is a real risk. If you get it wrong, sheep don't do that well. With lupins, you can feed whatever you like, whenever you like, as frequently as you like, and it's quite safe. And that's particularly so with young sheep like weaners. Weaners generally struggle with high rates of barley. They don't thrive like you think they should at high rates of barley. So in a maintenance situation for weaners, I strongly believe lupins and probably oats are probably the best feed source for them. But if you've got the option to buy lupins or buy barley, I'd put a 50% premium per value of megajoule on lupins for all those reasons. Plus they store a lot easier. Okay, look, just to give you some ballpark sort of figure, when we're talking maintenance, I use this as a quick, dirty calculation for maintenance requirement. I use this as a formula. It's basically 10% of the live weight plus 1.5, and that puts you in the ballpark of what the likely maintenance is. Now, it's not technically correct, but I find it puts you in the right ballpark, and that's where you need to start. Then you feed the sheep, then you see what they do. If they lose weight and you want them to maintain, you feed them a bit more. But this is a good starting point. Now, when we're looking at feeding sheep, or when we're looking at feeding sheep, I think that the two main risks that I see, it's in the timing. Feed prices, the timing of purchases. Buying feed early generally gets you cheap feed. If you wait until you absolutely need it, quite likely everyone else is in the same boat and the price is going to be substantially high. And the problem with that is, once you get into that territory, people generally don't do what they normally would do. So if grain's expensive, people tend to feed less than they probably should. If grain's hard to get, they generally buy less, feed less. If you've got grain on hand that you bought sort of well, people generally do the right thing when it comes to feeding sheep. So I guess my view is that if you've done your plan and you know what you need, it makes good sense to go out and buy the grain while it's still relatively well priced. Now, last week, people could still get lupins for $350 a tonne. I think it's changed a bit this week from what I gather. But it's still, anything under $400 I think is still good value for lupins, even if you don't use them all and you've got them next year. Because I can't see, I'm not predicting what the price of lupins will be, but I strongly suspect they're going to be expensive come harvest and into next year. So the relative cost to carrying excess lupins into next year is low. So if you've got the capacity to buy them, I'd suggest you go out and buy them, because it's highly likely the price is only going to go one way from here on. But once you've got good stores of grain on hand, you're generally more inclined to do the right thing from a profit perspective, but also from a sheep welfare perspective. And the sheep market, timing of sales, if you need to sell sheep, the sooner you recognise that and act on that, the better value you generally get for the sheep and the quicker they're off the farm. If you wait until you have to sell sheep, the real risk is that everyone else is doing the same thing, the market's come off, and the sheep may not be in the same condition they were a month or 2 months ago. So the value is less. So you're selling poorer quality sheep in a depressed market. So timing of sales really adds value to your business. If you get the timing right, you can sell sheep for good money. And that's still on the cards at the moment. Sheep are still bringing good money at the sale yards. Now this is just to give you some idea as to what the quantum of grain might be if we choose to have sheep in a confinement feeding situation or a drought lot or whatever you want to call it. Now these are used in the last trimester of pregnancy. Now this has relevance for people that might be joining sheep in November, December, and they stay in a feedlot through the summer. So at day 100, you're going to need something like 700 grams of lupins to maintain a pregnant ewe. Now hopefully it won't get to that, but I think if you're thinking that's one of your scenarios, it's useful to know that it's in that order. That's at $350 a tonne, that's 25 cents, so it could be a little bit more by the time we get to that period. But going up to lambing, it gets to nearly 1 kilogram of lupins a day, just so the ewes don't lose weight. Now John will talk to you about that, but it's important that when we've got pregnant ewes, that they don't lose weight, particularly when they start in marginal condition. Because the big cost of getting that bit wrong is we lose ewes. And there's a lot of money tied up. You've invested a lot of money to date, and to lose them at the death knock that's just loss all the way. Okay, now once we're lambing, now if you're thinking you might be lambing in a feedlot situation, I just want to show you the actual quantity of grain we need to provide to ewes if that's all they're getting. So it's in the order of 1.5 kilos of lupins equivalent on a daily basis. Now typically in the paddock, the sheep don't eat that amount of energy. Lactating ewes typically lose weight. That's quite normal. The issue is if you're in confinement, what's their condition score to start with? If they're skinny to start with, they don't have anything to lose. So you've got to do all you can to feed them what they need. But if they go into the feedlot relatively fat, that gives you a bit of a margin for error, so you can allow them to lose weight through lactation, which is perfectly normal. But it's just, I guess, just to get your head around, for a single bearing ewe, it's 1.5 kilos. For a for a twin bearing ewe, it's upwards of 2 kilos. So it's a lot of grain to be feeding sheep if you're in a feedlot situation. This is a calculation for, how much time have I got now, Mandy, please? Oh, okay, beauty. Okay, great, so we'll go through this. The point I want to make here is just basically, when we're looking at a least cost ration, we're trying to compare cost of energy per megajoule to what we think goes down the sheep's throat. And when we're in a feedlot, particularly, if we're spending a lot of money feeding sheep, it's important to monitor their weight to make sure they're doing what we think they're supposed to be doing. If we think they're maintaining but they're losing weight, it's important to know that. Because sheep that lose weight get to a point where they become a liability to your business. So it's important to know what they're doing, because then you can adjust your feeding program, particularly in a feedlot, but even in a paddock. If there's a tail, it generally helps to get that tail off and put them into a separate mob. Because when you have sheep losses through these conditions, it's usually the tail that are ones that are dying, and it's usually from poor condition. And often they're in poor condition because of behavioural problems in the flock. You know, the big ones are bullying the small ones. So by simply separating the tail from the main flock, they generally recover on their own. But it's important to do that to minimise stock losses. Okay, now this is just a simple demonstration of how we calculate the average cost of a ration, and it's just a proportion thing. Lupins in this ration are 40% at $3.30, $130 a tonne of the ration. Hay 60%, which is $60 a tonne. The total ration costs $192 a tonne. Pretty simple maths. But we need to do that to know what the cost is of feeding our sheep with the ration you've chosen. And to calculate the energy, it's exactly the same. 40% of 13 is 5.2, 4.2 for the hay. The average energy content of that ration is 9.4 megajoules per kilo. And the cost is simply 19 cents divided by 9.4. So it's 2 cents a megajoule or something like that. It's important to know that so we can make objective comparisons as to what we're feeding. Okay, this is a scenario where we've got a dry ewe, we've got 100 dry ewes in a confinement from July all the way through to May. And the objective is just to maintain them. So we're feeding 520 grams of lupins a day. There's 100 ewes and there's 2 rams. That makes up the flock that we're keeping. It ends up being something like, for that duration, it's 170 odd kilograms of lupins in total to put them in a confined feeding situation until the end of May. Now put that up just to demonstrate the quantum of grain that you're likely to need if that's part of your plan. And at $350 a tonne, which may be a little bit out of the money now, it's around $60 a head of cash. So for 100 ewes, it's about $6,000 to get them through in total confinement from now until end of May. Now you may not have them in confinement, you may have them in the paddock, but if you're feeding them pretty much all they need, it's still going to cost you that plus a bit more. There's about a 1.5 to 2 megajoule energy cost of having sheep in the paddock compared to having them in confinement. So I think a dry ewe in a confinement needs about 7 megajoules of energy a day. Out in the paddock, it's sort of 1.5, it's 8.5 megajoules thereabouts. So by taking them out of the paddock, putting them in confinement, you're saving 1.5 to 2 megajoules of energy cost on a daily basis. And these numbers are based on 7 megajoules of energy per ewe per day. Oh, it's down there, yep. Now if we look at that, if we get a bit of a spring, okay, we get some rain in August, we get a bit of a spring, this is a scenario where we get some paddock grazing, so they're in confinement here, they come out of confinement in the spring, we feed them, they get half their energy from grain, half their energy from the paddock in August, they're getting it all from the paddock in September, 75% is coming from the paddock in October, 60% from the paddock in November, and 50% from the paddock in December. So there's a bit of stubble grazing going on potentially. That's brought the total amount of grain needed down to something like 130 kilos of lupins. So you still need, if you get some spring, you're still going to need a reasonable quantity of grain to keep sheep in a feedlot, in a drought lot or a confinement feeding. It's $44. Now, looking at the profitability of sheep, on a DSE basis, they're worth about $50 a DSE, 2016. So you think 2018-19, it'll be $40 to $50 a DSE would be my feeling, that's the numbers we'd work on. Now we use worth about 1.5 DSEs. So just very roughly, see John frowning at me, very roughly you can see there's good money in trying to retain sheep if they have real value to your business, because the profit's there. It's a cash flow consideration. Right, now this is where it gets a bit hairy. Oh, bugger. Right, okay. I did a scenario where we looked at April lambing in a feedlot. Now we're not promoting that as something people should do, but if you're thinking about it, the quantity of grain goes up to something like 250 kilograms of lupins, and the cost is in excess, well, it's around $80 to $90 a head of grain, of lupins, at $350 a tonne. Now the big thing is here, is that when we get to these, if you're lambing in April, the feed requirement goes up substantially in these months here. And it's around, in May, April, May, it's around 1.8 on average, it's around 1.8 to 2 kilos per head per day, because they're in the peak of lactation. And I've made the assumption that going into that phase, they're in condition score 2.5. So the twinning rate's low, the single rate's relatively high, the dry rate's high. So there's 10% dry ewes, I think I said 70% singles and 20% twins, which is normal for a low twinning rate. And that brings the lupin usage to 1.8 kilos per head per day. But the important figure is, to lamb in a feedlot, they're going to need in excess of 250 kilos of lupins if they're in confinement all the way through. So there's a real cost. And what I'd suggest is, if you don't reliably have access to that grain or that level of cash, lambing in a feedlot is probably something you want to make sure you don't do, because if you get it wrong, it could be potentially disastrous. Because lambing for the ewe is quite a high risk strategy if, nutritionally, she's behind. If they're too skinny and they're not getting enough feed, it won't go well. So that's a very important decision. If someone's contemplating, if you're talking to clients and they're thinking they'll lamb in a feedlot, you need to do some pretty good sums to make sure they've got the capacity physically and financially. I'm not trying to be the doctor of doom, but I think we just need to be quite conscious of what the real risks are of lambing in June. Now I think it's probably worth bringing that up now, is, look, the issue with that, and this is the real issue with autumn lambing, is that you don't have any information about the season. You're stuck. Once you join in November, December, you're obviously committing to a lambing in April, May, and the season may not have broken normally, so you don't know. So my thought is, this is possibly a situation where You either decide you're going to lamb in June, July, or you possibly don't join the ewes. So if June, July lambing doesn't appeal from a risk point of view, I'd say, and you're considering having to lamb in a feedlot, option 3 might be just don't join. And we can discuss that at some point in another forum perhaps, but you've just got to be really conscious of lambing in a feedlot. It's a relatively high risk procedure. And people in the east did it in the droughts, so it can be done, but it's not for people with poor sort of sheep management skills. Okay, now the other option we've got is grazing crops. Now this information's come from Ed Riggle and Phil Barrett-Leonard, but it's basically all about grazing the crops relatively early but lightly to have less impact on the crop. But grazing crops provides a source of high energy food, it's got reasonably good protein, and sheep do perform well on crops. Now if you don't have any crops, obviously it's just not an option, clearly. But the issue is in the spring, what are the crops looking like? Do they have capacity for a light graze or not? Later in spring, if you've made the judgment that the crop's going to fail, you've clearly got a stockpile of feed in the paddock that's available for sheep. And sheep, particularly young sheep, will benefit greatly from high quality feed in the spring. Now this is a graph that really demonstrates, what we've got here is the grain yield penalty as a percentage of the uncut control, okay? So it's basically saying if we graze late, so this is the grazing period here, if we graze late, the effect on the crop is substantial. Grazing early and light, the effect on the crop's minimal. So if we graze late and hard, there's a huge effect, there's a huge penalty on the crop. If we graze late and light, it's negligible. But certainly grazing crops is a real option and it will add real value to your sheep. So it's going to be a trade-off in value between what am I likely to get for my crop, nothing, something, a lot. What value does it add to my sheep? A lot, a lot, a lot. Now, which sheep to carry through? And I think there's just a few considerations I think we all need to think about. It's basically what's our carrying capacity now and potentially the spring. We'll have the Pastures from a Space people come in to give you some view as to what the options for spring might be in terms of pasture growth. Now, this one here, what's the current value that we know about? What are our sheep worth today? Potentially what they're worth in the future. Now, I say potential because we can only guess at their condition and at their price. Today is certain, we know that. Tomorrow is a bit uncertain, but we've got a rough ballpark figure that we can work to. What can we carry and reliably add value to? So what can we do really, do we think? What have we done before? What's new territory? What's the potential to lose value? So if we get it wrong, what might happen? Okay, and this one here is very important. What's the access to feed and how reliable is that access from a cash point of view and from a physical point of view? If you're running out of feed, what do you think you're going to do? And how reliable is that option to actually get the grain physically? Because if you get there and the grain's not there, you're in a very hard position. And John will talk about a little bit of priority about what sheep we might want to carry through. Now this one here, risk and reward to other livestock, is very important. For every sheep you keep on your farm, it's affecting the sheep next to it. So if you're keeping a mob of wethers because you think they're going to be more value in sort of September, October, they're eating feed that other sheep aren't getting. So if you've got your ewes you want to keep through into 2018 and you're keeping a mob of wethers, whatever the wethers eat, the ewes aren't going to get. And effectively, if you don't get a spring, what the wethers eat, you'll have to feed to the ewes because it's disappearing. So what you keep affects the sheep that are remaining on the farm. So what's the relative value of them compared to what they're taking from the other sheep? Now, I reckon, this is what I think, the sheep you want to hang on to for dear life, assuming sheep have a strong position in your business, okay, making that assumption, the 2.5, 3.5 year old ewes, they're the most robust and from a reproductive point of view, valuable sheep from a current and future value, they're the ones you try and hang on to the most. Rising maidens, mature ewes at 4.5, 5.5, 6.5, 7.5 ewes, they've got a short productive life, and they're the ones most at risk if next year isn't very good either. They tend to have a lot of twins, they tend to be a bit skinnier, so in a poor season, those older ewes that are joined represent high risk to your sheep flock and your business. So that's why we're sort of saying old ewes, you probably don't want to carry old ewes if you can't do it easily. Ewe lambs and obviously wether lambs, wether hoggets at the bottom of the list. Okay, market options. Look, when we've got small lambs, the air freight market, it's great, but it has its limits. Okay, it says 12 to 22 kilos. How does that sit? Yep. But they've got to be, that's 12 to 22 kilos dressed. Okay, so the live weight's around 30 kilos plus for a merino, something like that. Yep, and a crossbred, around the same.
Yeah.
Marginally lighter. Now, typically we wean sheep at 25 kilos. Now, for a lot of people, that's just not going to happen this year. They're probably going to be closer to 20 kilos at weaning. So to think you're going to wean substantial numbers into the air freight market straight away is a bit fanciful, really. Similarly, if you're looking to feed sheep into a feedlot, they generally have a minimum requirement of 25 kilos. So we need to think about that as to what we might do with our lambs. And there could be a case where you have to put money into sheep to feed them up to a point where you can physically move them. They're worth nothing and you can't move them, compared to feeding them $10, $15, $20 of grain just to physically get them off your farm. Now with shippers, and I'm willing to take guidance here, it's really less about frame size at the moment, it's more about condition. So if they're skinny, doesn't matter how big they are, the market's not strong. Correct, thank you.
Fat sheep always sell.
Sorry?
Fat sheep always sell.
Excellent. It's nice to know elders and Landmark have the same view on things. That's good. Oh, look, just a point. Look, in farmer feedlots, typically the conversion ratio is 10 to 1. I think if you read all your books, it's 7 to 8. In reality, it's closer to 10. The professional feedlotters can get it down to 6 to 8, but generally my experience with farmers, it's 10 to 15 for a whole range of reasons. But if you're doing your sums, really work on that as a minimum, because I reckon for most people that's what it would be. So if you're looking to feed weaners up, at least 10 to 1. Okay, what I'll just do now to finish is in the droughts back in the 2000s in the east, following that sort of period, Holmes and Sackett did a reasonably extensive survey of sheep farmers in how they drought-fed sheep. And I got, a long time ago, I got this information from David Sackett. It's basically the results of a survey from people that drought-lotted sheep through that sort of phase in the eastern states. The things they looked at were these points here: death rates, culling rates, right down to how long did sheep stay on the feed in feedlots. These are the average results. Death rates, probably should say mortality, were relatively low, but the range was huge. 22%. That's you'd have to say that's an outright disaster. But the average at 1.8 suggests there weren't many of them. Time on feed, this is interesting. There were some sheep on feed for more than a year, but the average was 136 days, obviously. Mob sizes varied a fair bit, but around 1,200. So we're not talking thousands and thousands in a mob, we're talking 1,200, okay? Right, and our troughs. Do we have troughs or not? Feeding on the ground, slightly lower mortality rates than feeding in a trough. That's great, because feeding on the ground is a lot easier. But look, there's a mob size effect. When we have small mobs, feeding on the ground works a bit better than feeding in a trough. But once we get to big mobs, troughs are more important. Now what we've got here is mortality rate and mob size. So as mob size is increasing, feeding on the ground has higher mortality rates. Mortality rates with sheep fed on the ground increases as mob size goes up. Now you can imagine you've got 5,000 sheep scrambling for the same trail. You get a lot of competition, weaker sheep get pushed out, that's sort of what happens. So after, just from this graph, obviously around 2,000 plus, that's where troughs start to be essential in terms of minimising losses. Now managing the tail size, this is really what makes or breaks feed lots, drought lots, confinement feeding. It's about taking the weaker ones out and putting them somewhere on their own. And it's a behavioural response. The weaker sheep get out-competed by the bigger sheep, so they get hassled by the bigger sheep, they get bullied by the bigger sheep, and it affects how they eat and how they perform. Simply taking them off, put them on their own, they just recover without any other special treatment. So drafting the tail off on a regular basis is essential. Now, it's not daily, it's not weekly. So the summary from that work was, if you're putting sheep into a feedlot, we're trying to keep them at something like a 2,000 per hectare feedlot, so that's 1 every 5 square metres, so it's not intense. When you see them in that sort of situation, you think there's a fair bit of room still. So they don't have to be pushed up tight. We try and keep the mob size between 1,000 and 2,000. And I guess they're suggesting that we manage the tail every 2 months. But I guess it comes back to trusting judgment, that if you can see a tail, you need to act on it. And I guess my view of farmers is generally they're very good at observing things. If your sheep have changed, people generally pick it up pretty quickly. The weakness is how quickly they do something about it, because there's other things going on. If you're busy seeding, your sheep are losing weight, you're thinking, well, I haven't got time to do anything about it. But in a feedlot, if you see a tail developing, it's very important to do something about it quickly, because that's where your losses come from. Okay, now roughage. Look, nutritionally, sheep don't need roughage in their diet. They can get by on a completely fibre-free diet if they have to. But one thing, fibre in a feedlot, in a drought lot, in a confined feeding environment for a long time, one thing roughage does, it affects the sheep's behaviour. Now ruminants, by their very nature, they ruminate, right? So they've got to stop what they're doing, bring it up, chew it, swallow it, bring it up, chew it, right? That gives them something to do. When they have a very low fibre diet, they don't do that, they've got time on their hands. And what happens is, the bigger ones then look around for something to do and they pick on the smaller ones. What that does is, that just makes the smaller ones lose weight. They stop eating, they're stressed. By adding fibre to the diet, roughage to the diet, it just moderates their behaviour. And that's what's happening here. Lower mortality rates, and it's simply a behavioural. It's not a nutritional effect, it's a behavioural response. Generally, the worse quality roughage, the better response you get. So this is hay versus straw. This is poor doer, so it's not mortality, it's just sheep not doing well. And it's all about modifying the sheep's behaviour. It's also good from a ration point of view, because straw is relatively cheaper than hay. I think that's the thing. And we're not talking a great deal, we're only talking 1 kilogram a head a week of straw, so it's not huge volumes of straw they need. And I think, okay, so the recommendation for a confinement feeding is about done. Yep, good.
Questions?
And yep, so you can do that, and I think that's it. Yep, so good. We'll take questions now if there's any, Mandy.
Perth will start. Robin?
Hi Ashley,
Robin.
It's very talk. When you're feeding 2 kilos of lupins per head per day, and are you feeding hay as well?
Look.
Might repeat the question so they can hear
Oh, Robin the vet has just asked me if I'm feeding 2 kilos of lupins, do I provide any straw or hay? Is that what you're saying?
Any roughage?
Any roughage.
Yeah.
I reckon lupins are a no. Look, short answer is no. From rumen function point of view, my understanding and my experience is that there's enough fibre in lupins for the rumen to function properly. There's clearly an excess of protein, but I think lupins are a standalone feed from my experience. You can certainly reduce the lupin component from a cost point of view and include hay or something else, but you're looking at me quizzically.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is an issue that's been around for a long time, and we've done work on it, and you can't feed 2 kilos you can't feed 2 kilos of lupins without roughage. And the best way to understand that is to try to make some bread with lupins, lupin flour. It's just completely different.
You're saying the sheep can't physically eat it, or they don't perform?
It's a lot for them to eat for a start.
Yeah.
But it's more than likely it'll cause both acidosis, but also just the rumen just doesn't work when you've got that amount of lupins in it, because it's such a viscous material.
Yep.
That the physics of
Okay.
the rumen just don't work. So
What's your limit in terms of kilos per day?
I don't know, but I'm very sceptical about the I mean, when you're feeding lupins in the paddock, that's fine because you've got some paddock feed. But if you're just feeding in a feedlot and you're feeding 2 kilos a day, I'd reckon you'd be in trouble.
Sure. Okay, I'll take that. Yep, sure, definitely. It's highly likely people won't feed that quantity. Physically, I don't think a sheep could eat that much in a day anyway, but I certainly take your point, Robin. Yeah.
Not sure this is working. But any further questions in South Perth, and then we'll go to the regions.
Pellets.
Thank you. Look, pellets, fantastic product. Pellets are great because you know what you're buying. They're highly specified. They're quite safe for sheep, and they're designed to be eaten in large quantities. All right. So as a product, they're just fantastic. It's simply just cost per unit of energy and how easy they are to fit into how you feed. So it's simply a cost issue. For a lot of people, pellets are great because you can buy them in 20, 30 tonne lots, whereas when you buy lupins, you've got to buy a trailer load, and they might think, well, what am I going to do with that? But similarly also, if you're in a feedlot, I guess you buy them as you need them, and you know what you're getting, and we know reasonably accurately what live weight performance should be. So, look, they're great. It's just for a lot of people, it's simply cost. But at the end of the day, if that's all you can get, that's what you get. It's simple. But they're a great product generally, yeah.
Do we have any questions from the regions?
Anyone there?
No questions from the regions at the moment? Okay. Thank you, Ashley. Thanks for that in-depth presentation. I'd like to thank Ashley for that. And I'd like to ask John Young to come up and join us. And John's really doing a bit of a follow-on to what Ashley started talking to us about, and providing some analysis, financial analysis, and some recommendations on sheep to keep. Let's get your presentation up, John. Now, for those of you who don't know John, John is a economic modeller and does a lot of full farm enterprise analysis. He's a sheep farmer from Kojonup, or I can almost say was a sheep farmer from Kojonup, and now is full-time doing economic analysis nationally, so not just here in Western Australia, about sheep. So welcome, John. Let's use that and that.
Yeah, thanks, Mandy. Yeah, as Ashley said, droughts aren't a new thing. We've had a couple of droughts in the last sort of decade. This is making the third one, and our observation after bad droughts has been that farmers that have acted quickly, reduced stock numbers, have come out the other end looking best. So that's been our sort of general recommendation: act quickly, reduce your flock in a timely manner, and if you've got an exit strategy like Ashley outlined, even better. But what I want to talk about today is how this 2017 drought is sort of turning out or is looking different than the others. And really, there's three things that are different. The first is that as Ashley pointed out, the market conditions are much better at the moment. We're looking at record profitability for sheep. If you look at nominal, it's at much higher levels than the normal, but even if you look at the sort of CPI adjusted, it's still the second highest profitability we've had for sheep for the last 30 years. So things are good for sheep. There's much more incentive or much more price incentive to keep animals on farm. The second are that there's more sale options available for livestock and stores. So Ashley talked about the air freight lamb market that's a relatively new thing. That's an option for selling lighter lambs that didn't used to exist. There's also, and it's probably associated with the high price, there's a reasonable market for livestock to the eastern states. So what that means is that a bit of that pressure to act quickly is reduced, because it would seem that the market is not going to collapse like it has in previous droughts, where if you didn't sell now, next week was too late. That looks like it's not going to be the case, or at least as badly the case this time as it has been in the past. And the third thing is that we're also a little bit more sophisticated in how we can calculate what are the priority sheep. We know more about the effects of nutrition on ewes, particularly through the Lifetime Wool project, which is being rolled out as Lifetime Ewe Management. We have a much better handle on what's the impact of reducing nutrition to ewes, and we can start putting some values on, well, is it better to maintain? Is it what's the cost of losing weight? What about having your ewes gain weight if you're having to feed grain? We can start putting some numbers that we can hang our hat on some of those things, and we just didn't have the data to be able to do that in the past. So a bit of a summary about what's required is, and the sort of what Ashley's been talking about, the decision process that farmers need to follow. Well, first of all, sell the low priority stock, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail, but basically what Ashley covered with his slide. Then retain the medium and high priority sheep and feed them. And Ashley did some sums, and I've done some sums looking at, well, what can we afford to feed? How long can we keep? How long can we afford to keep sheep? And so I want to run through some of that. And then if you're lucky enough to have some spring feed available or some stubbles post-harvest, what are the priority sheep to utilise that scarce spring feed? Prioritising spring feed is not something we normally have to do. Normally there's more than enough to go round, and we just put out everything that wants to gain weight. This year is likely to be different, so what is the priority? Which sheep are going to give you the best bang for your buck for that spring feed, if you're lucky enough to have some? And then the last area I want to look at is the stuff I've looked at under those first sort of three headings. If you're in the situation where you've got access to and can afford to buy sufficient grain to do what you want, what is profitable to do with your sheep. So if it gives you a return on your money, you've got access to the grain to do it. But that's not the case for everybody. And as Ashley said, if you're going to have a sheep in a feedlot for an extended period of time, you're looking at sort of potentially up to 200 kilos, 250 kilos of supplement. So there's a lot of money required in order to feed your sheep if they're going to be in the feedlot for a long period of time. So what happens if cash flow is restricted, or if grain price is higher? So I want to spend a little bit of time looking at that. So selling the low priority stock. This is a copy of Ashley's heading and of Ashley's slide, and I agree with that those 2.5, 3.5-year-old ewes are your high priority stock. They are easy to look after. They're going to produce you a lamb, and that's good value. They're also producing a good wool clip. The maidens aren't quite such a high priority because they generally have a slightly lower lambing percentage. Your mature ewes, 4.5-year-old, as Ashley said, they do produce a lot of lambs, and they're producing twins, so that's technically more difficult to manage, but they've also got less life left ahead of them. So if you're starting to look into the future, those 4.5-year-old ewes have only got sort of 1-2 lambs left, whereas your maidens have got multiple lambs in their lifetime. So that's why the mature ewes are slightly lower priority. The ewe lambs, again, not going to give you a lamb next year, and more expensive to look after, so a lower priority. And then the wether lambs or the wether hoggets are the lowest priority. A little bit of extra detail to add over that is if you've got some ewes that you're not planning on mating next year, so Ashley talked about if you're in a situation where you've got no paddock feed and aren't looking like you're going to have any paddock feed through till the break next year, and you normally lamb before the break, your only option is either to lamb in a feedlot or not to mate. Now, if you're not mating, that puts those ewes down near the bottom of the list as far as the priority sheep to keep. So maybe the decision is if you're not planning to, or if you're in a situation where you've got no feed and you'd have to be lambing in a feedlot, don't mate, don't keep, like sell those sheep. That looks, if sheep aren't a priority part of your business, then again, selling sheep becomes a better issue. Keeping sheep is a lower priority. The other overlay to put over these groups is the condition score of the sheep. Ashley talked about the tail and managing that tail, and that's important in confinement, but it's also important in allocating the feed to the sheep. The skinny sheep are a high priority for feeding, but they're a low priority for keeping. But if you keep them, they're a high priority to feed, perhaps you're best off not to keep them. So that becomes part of the decision-making process about where the cut-offs are to which sheep to keep, which sheep to sell. Probably should go back. The sums that Ashley's talked about, and that I've done some as well, we can afford to keep ewes in a feedlot for 365 days, lamb them in the feedlot, feed them the full ration, and the profitability, allowing for some deaths in the feedlot, allowing for some husbandry costs, the cost of the grain and the husbandry is offset by the value of the lamb and the value of the wool that the sheep grows. So at the moment, a sort of rough rule of thumb is you're getting about a half or a bit more than half of the value of the grain that you're feeding a sheep at maintenance, you're getting back in wool cut, provided you've got a merino and not a shedding breed. But for a reasonable merino operation, you're getting at least half the value of your grain back in wool. And then you've got the other half is coming from the lamb. So it's reasonably easy to do those calculations and show that that the value of the wool and the lamb offsets the cost of the grain, and the profit that you make is what I'm calling the rebuilding margin. So sheep, if you've destocked your farm, then sheep will be more valuable for you next year than they are this year. And so what I'm calling the rebuilding margin is the increase in value of stock next year compared with this year. So most people would think about what I've put on as the second point on the graph, but I think the first point is more important. If you've sold down some of your flock this year, so you've sold those low priority classes, the dry sheep, the younger ewes perhaps, then essentially you're understocked next year, and that makes more stock next year more valuable. Example you can think about there is normally an operation has to sell their surplus young ewes because there's not enough space on the farm to keep them, whereas if you're lightly stocked or you're understocked compared with where you'd like to be, then you could keep those cull young ewes, cull ewe hoggets, and make them to a terminal sire, cut some wool, get a crossbred lamb, and then sell the ewe at the end of that year instead of selling her at the beginning of the year. So that's what I'm calling the rebuilding margin, and the calculations that we've done show that that can be sort of $40 per head, even if prices don't go up. So if you've got a lower stocking rate than you'd like, then extra sheep on the farm are sort of $40 per head more valuable than you would normally think of them. So this rebuilding margin is quite important. And the second part of it is that after a drought, supply of sheep onto the market is lower because people are retaining more of their animals, and demand is higher because some of the people who sold their flock down are wanting to buy breeders back in again. So we would expect to see prices in the sale yards increase next year. But even if they don't, there's still the rebuilding margin from point one. So if you've got your ewes in a feedlot for the 12 months, then the profit you're making is really what I'm calling the rebuilding margin, because the costs are covered by the sale lamb or the lamb that you've produced and the wool. But the rebuilding margin will be lower for people who've got alternative land use, that they can say, okay, well, I'm not actually understocked because I've increased my crop area. Now, if that's an option for people, then that means that rebuilding margin's not as large. But my observation has been that a lot of people have increased their crop area a lot over the last few years, and so there's a question as to whether you can profitably increase it even further if you sell down your sheep flock. The rebuilding margin is also less for farmers who, as Ashley says, that sheep aren't a core part of their business, which means that the rebuilding margin is larger if sheep are a core part of your business. So if you're focused on your sheep enterprise and you're making profit and you see that that's a good part of your business, then keeping this rebuilding margin in mind as part of your calculations on profitability is important. So that's the first part. So if it is profitable, or if it can be profitable to keep sheep in a well-run confinement operation, and a well-run confinement operation is not the one that's losing 22%, it's the one that's losing 2 to 3%, then what are the priorities to feed? And I've put a return on investment for the extra feed that's required. And ewes that are in condition score less than 2.3, I've said that if they're down in that sort of condition score now, they are a high risk. If you choose to retain those ewes, they're a high risk for mating, because if you mate them, then the death rates for those ewes will be much higher. We've got data on that shows quite a good relationship between condition score and death rate. Condition score getting below 2.5, death rate of the ewe, condition score 2.5 at lambing, death rate of the ewes starts to increase. So there's an animal welfare issue mating below condition score 2.3. There's also a profit issue mating at condition score below 2.3. So it's feeding those ewes to gain weight, to be above that cut-off for mating is a high priority use of your supplement. And it gives you a return on investment of somewhere around 500%. Depends a little bit on what condition they start in and how much you need to feed in order to get over the cut-off, but it's a big number. Which is saying that it can pay to feed sheep to gain weight, to have a lamb. it can also pay to feed sheep that are in condition score 2.5, so you're going to make them and get a moderate lambing percentage. You can afford to feed them up to gain 0.2, 0.3, 0.4 of a condition score and get 5 or 10% more lambs in confinement. That will pay. So if they're in confinement already, it'll pay to feed those ewes to gain weight to be at a slightly better target condition at joining. So these are some of the calculations we can do using the lifetime ewe management data, and so we can be fairly certain that this is the case. We know the response to extra condition score at joining on scanning percentage. We know the effects of condition score at joining and live weight change during pregnancy on birth weight, and we know the effects of birth weight on lamb survival. So we're pretty certain that we can estimate the effects of feeding in that lead up to joining and through pregnancy on what's going to happen to your number of lambs weaned, and lambs weaned turns into profit. So that's a new message that feeding grain to sheep to gain weight is profitable, and it's different this year because of the high prices, and it's different because of that rebuilding margin. If it wasn't for those, then we'd have our standard lifetime ewe management message, which is it pays to maintain sheep with grain, it doesn't pay to put weight on sheep with grain. So this is a slightly different message than the lifetime ewe management message. But if ewes are in condition score 3, then it doesn't pay to gain weight, it only pays to maintain weight, and your return on investment for maintaining weight for those condition score 3 animals is about 50% return on investment. So that's a reasonably solid return, and this is working on sort of $350 a tonne for grain, which seemed like a reasonable number when I did the calculations, but as actually observed, prices are starting to move, so that's starting to squeeze that 50% return. So moving on, for the groups that are or the areas that are lucky enough to have a bit of spring feed, I've done some looking at, well, what's the priorities for allocating that scarce feed. Normally there's enough to go round. This year there's probably not. And again, if you've kept your ewes that are too thin to mate, they're the highest priority. The last slide was sort of saying, okay, that's about a 500% return on investment. This is looking at it in a slightly different way, saying, well, how much in dollars per kilo do you gain by having those animals gain the weight rather than a different group of animals gain the weight on your pasture feed? So these ewes are sort of turning that extra feed into profit at about $15 per kilo of live weight. So I did that calculation saying, well, if they're currently in, say, 2.1, so you're not going to mate them, you add 0.4 of a condition score, take them up to 2.5, so that's our mateable condition. How much feed does that require? You now get a lamb and the wool versus only getting the wool before. So that's how you get the $15 a kilo. It's actually $60 a head, but you've put on 4 kilos, so that's $15 a kilo. So again, it's really just saying it's a big number. If you only had to put on a smaller amount, then it's a bigger number. If you have to put on a bigger amount, then it's a lower number. But it's still a long way ahead of sort of number 2, sitting at $2.90 a kilo. So number 2 is MM, stands for merino ewes mated to a merino ram, because that was the other thing I forgot to mention about the merino ewe mated to a merino ram. In the rebuilding margin that I talked about, a merino ewe mated to a terminal sire doesn't get that rebuilding margin because you don't keep the crossbred lamb to rebuild your flock. They're sold sort of by definition. So the Merino operation gets the rebuilding margin. The Merino terminal sire operation doesn't get the rebuilding margin. It only gets a potential increase in value of the stock. Like Merino ewes to buy in might be more expensive next year. So if you're wanting to make them to a terminal sire, you're going to have to pay more for them, and that's a bigger cost to your business, i.e. keeping those ewes is of some higher value. But for the Merino, you get that plus the extra rebuild margin. So therefore, the Merino ewes are a higher priority. And at condition score 2.5, especially if they had twins last year, because that is likely to give you, they're more likely to give you a lamb again next year. And the maidens, because the maidens tend to be poorer mothers than the older ewes. So if you've got that maiden ewe in better condition at lambing, she's probably going to give you a slightly better bang for your buck than getting an older ewe in slightly better condition at lambing. So that's something we can't put sort of solid numbers on. It's just an observation and a feeling that's the case. A Merino ewe in condition score 3, she'll give you about $2.40 a kilo, and that's equivalent to a Merino to terminal sire ewe in about condition score 2.5. So, and they're returning $2.40. Something to think about here in relation to the value of ewes in different condition score. The calculations have been done on the value of an extra kilo of live weight on that class of sheep. And we would tend to expect that when you've got a certain amount of high quality feed in the paddock, that the skinny ewe will turn that into live weight more effectively than a fat ewe will turn that into extra live weight. So what that means is that these numbers, the $2.90 and the $2.40, will probably actually be spread apart if we'd done the calculation on the value of the feed rather than the value of the live weight that the feed is turned into. But I hadn't got that far, and it was partly because there's a lot of things that determine how's that extra kilo going to get turned into live weight, which is really what's the availability of that feed, and it was all too hard, so it didn't happen. The fourth group as priority was fattening cast for age ewes post weaning for sale. So that normally happens is you put post weaning, you put your ewes back out onto the spring flush. They gain weight for a while, then you sell them. But that process is the lowest priority of the sheep that could gain weight this spring. That's not one of them, and that's sort of equivalent to the Merino ewe being mated to a terminal sire who's currently in condition score 3. That's also a low priority use of your feed. 5, okay. So to put this into some context, a tonne of high quality green feed could probably achieve about 150 kilos of live weight gain. So if you're selling that down here, 150, that's sort of $300 worth of value here. Take it up there, you're getting closer to $450 worth of value, and allocate it up here and you're getting something closer to $2,000 worth of value. So we're talking about sort of hundreds of dollars per tonne of feed in your paddock if you allocate it well versus allocating it badly. So what about in a situation because all those calculations were done assuming that you can access the grain and you've got the money to do it, what are you going to get a return on spending the money? Or is it profitable? But it might still be profitable, but you just can't do it because you can't access the grain, either because it's not out there or because you haven't got any money in the bank to buy it. How do you allocate the feed then? And the return on asset return on investment starts becoming more important rather than just is it profitable or not, is which is the most profitable. So feeding for maintenance, return on investment 50%, feeding for live weight gain, even for the high priority sheep for live weight gain was only a return on investment of 40%. So feeding you'll use for maintenance becomes more important than feeding those condition score 2.5 ones up for extra lambs. And also I've worked out the break-even prices. So this is what happens if grain prices are higher. When do you stop feeding for live weight gain? When do you stop feeding for maintenance? So at live weight gain, 3.3 cents per megajoule. So that's somewhere $450 per tonne for lupins, 3.8 cents per megajoule. That's somewhere just a bit over $500 per tonne for lupins. So that's saying even at $500 a tonne, you can still afford to maintain your fat sheep and definitely maintain your thinner sheep. But the other question is, well, if you've only got a fixed amount of grain available that you can access, are you better off to have more sheep losing weight or less sheep maintaining weight? And that comes down to how long you're going to have the sheep in confinement for. If it's a short-term confinement, then it's better off to have more sheep losing weight slowly, because that saving in kilos per head is a relatively higher proportion of your total grain, because you're not doing maintenance for a long period. Whereas if you're doing maintenance for a long period, there's a lot of grain there, and the little bit you save by letting them lose weight is offset by the numbers that you can carry. And it's a pretty rough calculation, but because there's a lot of things that affect it, but it's about 9 months in the feedlot. You're better off beyond 9 months in the feedlot, you're better off to maintain, and that'll be more profitable than allowing slow weight loss. It also turns out that's a pretty sensible thing to do, because if you're going to have a long period in the feedlot, you probably don't know how long it's going to be. So if you're letting them lose weight, and it gets longer and longer, and you lose weight and you lose weight, and it gets longer and longer, and you lose weight and you lose weight, then you're going to end up in trouble. So if your target is maintenance, then you can stay in that feedlot for as long as it has to be. So with those targets, this is sort of reiterating what Ashley's saying, if you've got those targets, you need to calculate how much, if you're in this situation where you've got limited availability of funds, you need to calculate how many sheep you can afford to feed, because you don't want to have them in there for 9 months and then say, oh, I've run out of money now, but you haven't really done, a half-done job is not going to pay. So I said at the beginning, we've got a bit of time to make a decision. So you probably do have a month, maybe 2 months to make the decision about destocking. Then you're committed. So maintain your sheep so that they are saleable in that time. If you can make the decision quicker, that's better. But if you can't make the decision, you've probably got a bit of a window, provided you're maintaining your sheep. They're still going to be valuable. But then make sure you've done the sums well enough that you can afford to keep the sheep, that you can afford to feed the sheep that you keep. So conclusions are: sell your low priority sheep, sell more if you've got limited cash flow. Retaining and feeding sheep is profitable because of the high wool and meat prices. So if you can do it, it will pay. Live weight gain in confinement pays if condition score is less than 2.7, so that's a different message than because of the situation than we've had in the past. And for fatter sheep, target maintenance, unless you've got limited cash flow and limited grain availability.
Thank you, John. Do we have any questions here in South Perth to start? Robin Jacobs.
Yeah, thanks, John. I'm thinking that processors and live exporters are going to be pretty interested to know what the drought's going to do to the type and number of sheep that are going to come onto the market. And looking at that list of priorities, it doesn't look a lot different to me to what people's normal priorities would be. Like you'd sell those sheep, like your hoggets first and whatever. So do you expect a major change in the numbers and types of animals that are going to come on the market or not?
No, I think as you'd say, that is the priorities. What we're trying to say is if you've got to sell a few more than you normally sell, then that's the order to start peeling the onion. And I guess the other part of what I've been saying is that it is profitable to retain your breeding flock. So dry sheep, there's not... It's still potentially break even to keep a dry ewe, or a ewe that you're not going to mate this year but you could mate next year. It's still potentially profitable to retain her, but it's just a bit higher risk. So depending on how important sheep are to you, move her out the door. So the question about what actually happens out there, given that it can be profitable to retain your ewes, is really about how much importance do the producers put on their sheep enterprise, because it's profitable to retain that core breeding flock, but whether they want to, whether they can be bothered to, because putting sheep in confinement is a lot of work, and you have to be there because you can't have a day off because the sheep still need to eat. So it's a big commitment, and some people won't want to make that commitment. And so there still will be selling down of the core breeding flock, even though it's potentially profitable. It's still a good decision not to sell them if you can't be bothered. So that's a way of saying that what actually happens is really up to the farmer's decision making. So I can't actually answer your question. I can say they don't have to sell them, but it doesn't mean that they won't.
Further question here at South Perth? We'll go to the regions. Do we have any questions from the regions? There's been quite a lot to digest there, but I'm sure there are some questions brewing in people's minds. No? Blank silence out there?
Mandy, John Blake here. Can I ask a question?
Yes, please, John.
Two questions, I guess. One was, when you talk about return on investment, how long is that period for the return on investment?
Yes, that is something I did look at, was the payoff period. Well, not the payoff period, the period that you're getting your money back. And that was, one thing which I probably should have said at the time, the Merino Terminal Sire is a lower priority sheep, but you do get your money back much quicker than the Merino system, where you're getting probably 30 or 40% of your money this year, and the rest of it you get sort of later through the life of the animal that you've retained. So it's a less immediate payback for Merino than it is for Merino Terminal Sire. So we're looking at a payback 30% in the first year, another 20, and then the remaining 50 sort of over maybe even 3, 4, 5 years, that those extra ewe lambs that are born as a result of better feeding this year, that are born and retained in the flock, they're giving you a return over an extended period. So it's not immediate. It is spread over a bit of time.
Thanks. Can I ask a second question, Mandy?
Certainly, John.
I'm just grappling with the rebuilding margin of $40 a head. Is that additive? Does it mean if I've got a ewe to my business worth $60, its value to my business in 2018 is $100, or am I getting that wrong?
No, that's how it works, yes. And that was a number that was calculated in some whole farm modelling, where we looked at the value of increasing reproduction rate, and we looked at it in a sort of a standard scenario where the farm is fully stocked, and if you have a higher reproduction rate, then that means you have to have less sheep on the farm, because you can't have another mouth without displacing a different mouth. So it's sort of coming down to the opportunity cost of the feed. And then we compared that with a farm where they were understocked and wanting to rebuild, and that came up, even at the same price of sale sheep, that the value of the extra lamb went from $50 per head up to $90 per head in that sort of rebuilding phase. And so that is the case for all the classes of stock on the farm. They're all more valuable.
Okay, gotcha.
So yes, you're right, 60 plus 40 equals 100, and that's exactly what I've worked on in this calculation, is $100 per head for extra lambs.
Thanks, John. No more questions from Albany.
Ashley? Yep.
John can repeat this. If ewes are worth 150 to buy in, does that mean you can pay 190?
So Ashley's question is, if they're 150 to buy in, can you then afford to pay 190? And, or do you add the rebuilding margin to the 150? That's a little bit more complicated, because it depends whether the $150 per head is actually a sensible price, or whether that is not reflecting profitability of the animal. I tend to think that 150 is, that it probably is, or that it can be sensible if the price of stock stays where they are at the moment, with sort of lamb at $5.50 to $6 a kilo during the good time, not the sort of spring glut, but in the sort of off glut times, then the net present value, or the value of an extra sheep on your farm, is upward of $250 a head, which means you can afford to pay $150 for that ewe as a hogget, to go into your breeding flock. So in that situation, you do add the $40 rebuilding margin due to understocking to the 150, because by having retained that animal on the farm, you're in a position to be able to sell more animals at the currently inflated price. So you still get the $40 on top of the 150, but if and you're retaining the animals that you retain are worth the 150 to you to retain, at least. But if the 150 was a bit overblown and the market overshot the mark, then no, you can't add the 40 to the 150. So, but in the calculations, I haven't worked on $150 per ewe.
Can I just make a comment? Because we're about to finish, are we?
We can take another couple of questions, but go for it.
Excuse me, sorry. Look, I just want to make the comment that when people talk about selling sheep with a view to buy them back in, I think you need to view that with a sense of reality, is that it's extremely likely that the buy-in number is going to be substantially different to what they are now, high. So the reality is, when sheep go, it's highly likely that most people won't buy them back anytime soon. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is the decision to offload all sheep, it's quite a serious consideration, given the reality is that once they go, they're not going to come back anytime soon in any great number. So it's not a simple case of saying, oh yeah, the value's into selling them now, we'll buy them back next year at whatever price. The reality is you probably won't, because they will be expensive, and there's no guarantee it's going to rain next year either. So the point I'm making is not don't sell them, but there's a certain gravity to the decision to offload everything, and I think that needs to be done rationally and with all due consideration, because it's a significant change to the business if sheep are a valuable part of the operation and the farm business. So I guess that's just the point I want to make, that it's not a simple case of, oh yeah, get rid of them, we'll buy them back. That might be how it's done, but the reality is they may not come back in any substantial numbers anytime soon. So once they go, they're probably going to go for a long time on a lot of farms, if that's what happens. So that might be the right thing to do, the good decision, but it's not to be made lightly, I guess is my advice, I suppose.
Yeah, so to add to that, I think what I heard Ashley say was what farmers who sell their sheep, although they could buy them back, they tend not to. I would say that buying them back is more profitable than not buying them back, but if they tend not to buy them back, then that makes that rebuilding margin even larger, because you've got a hole in your flock that lasts for a much longer time than if you buy them back next year at an inflated price. So really that's just painting the picture that you can afford to keep the sheep, or farmers can afford to keep their sheep if they want to, and that will be profitable. So if you're a banker offering, looking at whether to give a farmer money to feed their sheep, then it's a good investment, and it'll give the farmer some profit to pay back the money you've loaned them. So that's really the picture I'm trying to paint, is that it can be profitable. It's really the farmer's choice as to whether they want to do that from a workload point of view. There's not a profit imperative to sell the sheep.
Thanks, John. We've got time for one very quick question.
Can I ask a question? So this is Tamara from Narrogin.
Hi, Tamara.
Hi. Would this be a good year as I suppose your view on the wool market? I don't know how the flock structures change, but would this be a good year to prioritise selling your mixed breed sheep and move back to more merino? Changing the.
If that was something you were wanting to do, then I would agree that is a good time, because those mixed breed sheep are probably easier to sell at the moment than merinos. And your merino, retaining your merinos, as we talked about before, gives you the rebuilding margin as far as profitability, future profitability goes, which is what the rebuilding margin is trying to capture. And you don't tend to get that as much with, say, a maternal breed, even though the ewe lamb can be, or is retained into the breeding flock. The rebuilding margin doesn't work as strongly for a maternal breed as it does for the merino. At least that's our sort of the modelling answer. So yes, I would agree with that. And as far as long-term profitability, I've been of the opinion for a long time that a merino, and if you want to produce meat, use a terminal sire rather than moving to a maternal breed. But there's lots of people that disagree with me about that. So I think it would come down to the individual farmer as to whether that's a move they want to make. It's not something that I would recommend or not recommend.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks very much for that session. That was information and data packed, but some important messages there. I'd like to thank John. And I suppose the thing we can take away is we're actually talking about what sorts of levels of return on investment and profit, rather than in previous years where we've had some other not so positive options to choose, which is really quite exciting. We'll now break for morning tea, and I'm saying 15 minutes, time to get us stand up, get a stretch, have a little bit of something to eat, and have some talk amongst yourselves. And we'll be back here in 15 minutes for the next session. Thank you. Now, for this next part of the morning, we've got quite a mix of talks, but we're going to start with a presentation from Kate Pritchett. Kate is going to give us a bit of an update on the sheep flock and some of the movements and sales. So we've got some of that background data. Kate's a industry analyst with us here in the department. And Kate, if you'd like to come up now, and we'll get started. And then we'll go, in the later part of the session, we will spend some time going into some of the more detailed production information.
Okay, I'm just clicking through them rather than using this.
The regions, you've seen the presentation now?
Yeah, it's all good.
Thank you.
Yep, seeing it.
Good morning. Okie doke. Today I'm just going to give you a brief overview of the WA sheep flock, where it stands at the moment and some of the trends that are coming out right now, and seeing if anything's changed in the immediate past. Just a bit of an outline. First of all, I'll talk about the current flock. Then I'll have a bit of a look at the flock projection for 2016-17. Then we'll go through some turn-off and some slaughter information, as well as some interstate transfers and some of the prices, as well as the sale yard throughput. Okie doke. After the last 2 decades of decline, the WA sheep flock seems to have levelled out at around between 13.5 million and 15.2 million total sheep and lambs. Now this chart shows the total flock size and the number of breeding ewes over the past 6 years up until mid-2016, which is the latest ABS release. It is the new ABS information which has a new cut-off limit where they changed the estimated value of agricultural operations from 5,000 to 40,000, so it has brought it down slightly compared to previous releases. The official figure for the Western Australian sheep flock as of mid-2016 was 13.9 million total sheep and lambs, and that also included 7.3 million breeding ewes. Now that accounted for about 52% of the total flock. That's actually a bit of a decline. In 2010-11, the breeding ewes made up about 60% of the flock, and it has come back to about 52% 2015-16. However, that is still up compared to the 45% back in 1990 when we were basically a wool flock. 82% of those ewes were merino ewes, which is a lot higher than the national average, which was only 68%. So it shows that we still do have a much stronger merino base than the rest of the country. There was about 4,500 farms or sheep businesses, which would make the average sheep per farm about 3,000, which is also a substantial increase compared to 2010-11. Now this is the flock projection for what may have been in place for the close of 2016-17. With the opening ABS number of 13.9 million head and an average marking rate of 90%, which was the 5-year ABS average, that would give us about 5.82 million lambs marked. If we estimate that total turn-off may have come to about 5.88 million, that would give us a closing number of about 13.1 million sheep and lambs. Now that's just under a 6% decline throughout the course of that financial year in the size of the flock. Now the marking rate over the last few years has been on a bit of a growth trend. It has grown quite considerably. However, it's largely been neutralised by our increased turn-off, which has also grown. And as you can see there, the 5.82 million is less than the turn-off of 5.88 million. Now, if everything else was kept the same, in order to maintain the flock so that we would close at 13.9 million, we would need a marking rate of about 102%. Now, just having a closer look at turn-off, keep in mind 2016-17 isn't a full financial year yet. We're still waiting on the June data, so it's only got 11 months. Though we do have the full year data for the interstate transfers. So even with the June data missing, the lamb slaughter is higher than it has been for most of the years. The only year that was higher was 2015-16, but we are on par to overtake that at the moment. As a proportion of the total turn-off, it is higher than what it was in 2015-16. The lamb slaughter accounted for 49% of the total turn-off in 2016-17, first 11 months. The sheep slaughter accounted for 16%. Now that is very low, but it could possibly be due to the good season last year, as well as the high sheep meat prices and the high wool prices might have led people to hold on to them for a little bit longer. Live export accounted for 29% of the total turnoff, and the interstate transfers accounted for 6%. Now that does sound like it's very low, but in comparison to most years when interstate transfers only account for between 1 and 3%, 6% is quite a remarkable increase. So through 16-17, over the full financial year, we had interstate transfers came to 313,500 head. So it's quite a lot larger, as you can see by the yellow line on this graph. It's a remarkable increase compared to the last 3 years. It's actually a 274% increase year on year compared to the year before. 67% of the interstate transfers were adult sheep, or 211,000, whereas 33% were lambs, or 102,000. And so far, in the first half of 2017, there's been 99,000 sheep transferred east. 73% of those have been adult sheep and 27% lambs. Now, despite the dry season coming on this year, the majority of those interstate transfers actually occurred in the latter half of last year as opposed to this year. So I do think they may have been largely price driven as opposed to feed availability driven. Now this is the sale yard prices. It is a bit of a busy chart. The chart at the top is the mutton price in the sale yards for both WA and Victoria, WA being the brown one and Victoria being the blue line. And the bottom chart is the heavy lamb sale yard price for WA and Victoria. And this sort of shows why I think it may be price driven. It may change in the coming months though. In late 2016, there were pretty large price differences between WA and Victoria. In October 2016, the Victorian sale yard indicator for mutton was 411 cents compared to 284 cents in WA. For a 24 kilogram carcass weight animal, that is a difference of $30.48 per beast. Between July and December, that difference remained at between $20 and $31. So it's still quite a large difference all the way through the latter half of 2016. In 2017, that gap has reduced for mutton, but it's still quite significant. It narrowed to $4.13 in March, when the Victorian sheep were around 458 cents per kilo and WA's were about 441. But it did widen back out to $19.30 in June. There's also a similar story to the heavy lambs. In late 2016, there was a significant difference in the price of heavy lambs between WA and Victoria. In July 2016, the price difference between the two sides of the country came to $41.62 for a 24 kilogram animal. At that time, the Victorian heavy lamb was 654 cents compared to WA's 481 cents per kilo. In September, it was almost $37, and in October, it was $33. So the driver was quite large in the terms of the price differences. Though in 2017, the price difference for heavy lamb has actually narrowed quite a lot. In June, it came right back down to a difference of $6, so it's come right back. I think Victoria offered an average of 660 cents per kilo in June compared to WA's 635 cents, so it wasn't quite as marked. Now, despite there still being quite a significant gap between the WA and Victorian sheep prices, there has been significant growth in WA sheep prices so far in 2017. And that has been largely reflected through the sale yard throughput. Now this is the monthly, this is the monthly sale yard throughput for WA. As you can see, there's been quite considerable growth from March onwards. And that's for both sheep and lambs. Between January and June, the sale yard throughput in 2017 was 50% higher than at the same period in 2016 for lambs, and 30% higher for sheep. In March, the lamb throughput reached 107,000, which was a monthly increase of 76% for lambs, and for March, sheep throughput reached 87,000, which was an 85% increase. That is in line with the price increases that we saw in the previous chart. The sale yard throughput has increased at the same time as the price increase. But I'm not entirely sure where these sheep have gone, whether they were restockers or whether they went elsewhere. The slaughter hasn't risen at that rate, which we'll see in a second. There was a little kick in March for lamb slaughter, but it's actually declined over that period. And mutton slaughter has declined in general. Both mutton and lamb reached a low point in April before lifting in May. And if I look at the interstate transfers were higher in February than they were in March, so they haven't quite been accounted for in shifting east either. And in looking at live exports, March and April were both lower than February live exports, so they haven't disappeared out that way either. Now just a quick look at slaughter to finish off. The small chart at the top is the annual sheep slaughter on a financial year basis. Keep in mind 2016-17 is 11 months as opposed to 12. And then the larger chart at the bottom is a monthly breakdown of the last couple of years. Lamb slaughter was 2.69 million so far in 2016-17. It is on par to overtake 2015-16 when 2.75 million lambs were slaughtered, but it is up 7.2% year on year for the same time period. Sheep slaughter, however, has down quite a lot. Lamb slaughter peaked in November when it reached 323,000. Now, that is that big peak there. There appears to have been a change in the slaughter pattern though. For the first quarter of the last 3 years, the lamb slaughter has increased to the peak in around March or April, which is where those arrows are pointing. However, if you have a look at 2017, at that same period, it was actually declining instead of increasing. So I'm not sure whether that is because there was a short supply because there was such high slaughter in November that it overcompensated, or whether they're being held onto and retained on farm somewhere. It also fits in with the previous chart though, where they're not going interstate and they also weren't going live export, and apparently they're not going slaughter either, so it sort of looks towards maybe being retained somewhere for the time being, though whether they'll come back onto the market later on in the year as the conditions get worse, we don't know. And that's where I'll leave it.
Thank you, Kate. There's quite a lot of data in there, but we do have time for one quick question. But Kate also has her latest edition of Sheep Notes now available. So if you go to our website and search on Sheep Notes, you'll see the latest edition, and you can also sign up for further editions. And all that data is in that latest edition too. Any quick questions for Kate? Okay, thank you very much, and thank you very much, Kate, for that. Kate will be around, well, in South Perth for further questions, but I'm sure online, if there are any, we can add to that. Now, welcoming up to the stage Danny Roberts. Danny's a veterinary officer from the department. He's had extensive experience in both sheep and cattle, and Danny's going to talk to us about weaners and some of the decisions around that important class of sheep.
Thank you very much. I just want to just go over what is natural weaning, if you like, and consider that that process. And basically, from my understanding, there's a strong ewe-lamb bond for the first 90 days of that lamb. And and this is despite, while it's driven by the strength of the milk yield drives that bond initially, the bond remains there as the yield drops off. Then after about 100 days, the animals, the separation between the ewe and lamb becomes quite quick. As I said, milk yield is the major determinant of the strength of the bond, and there is a point in time where the ewe decides to do her own self-weaning as a threshold level, and that can occur as early as 55 days of age, and when the ewe decides to wean, it's over a week period, slowly over a period of time, where and generally it can take as long as 135 days when lactation is restricted. So when we're talking about early weaning and times of weaning and that sort of stuff, it's around associated with what's not best for the lamb necessarily. It's how much money can we save feeding the ewe, and that's the main driver for an early weaning versus a late weaning in a dry season. So if you are going to lamb wean before day 90, and that's the age of the lamb here, the most important thing is the size of the lamb. It needs to be roughly 10 kilograms per 10 kilograms, and the other criteria people use is about a minimum of 8 weeks of age. As I said, you're doing the time when it is actually stressful for the ewe and lamb, more stressful than if you waited after day 90 of the age of the lamb. There are certain things you need to do to ensure a successful early weaning, and one of the main ones is to train the lamb to eat the product that you want them to eat after the weaning, be it lupins or pellets. And that means you need to expose it minimum 3 times if it hasn't been exposed during the feeding up until that time. So if it hasn't been exposed to pellets and you want to feed pellets, you need to get pellets to the ewe and lamb before you wean, at least 3 times, ideally 6 times, to allow the lamb to take on the pellet quickly. Otherwise, it's going to take 5 to 10 days before it gets to know what the feed is, and during that time it loses weight because it's not eating as much as it can do. You also need high density, energy density feeds, so you're talking about 11 megajoules, and as Ashley said, you need quite high protein. And the earlier you wean, the higher the protein. So ideally, say 16% would be if you're weaning at 8 weeks, 16 or 18%. And if you are weaning and you've got some green feed, in my opinion, you need at least 1,000 kilograms of dry feed to wean those lambs onto of food, because that at least gives us enough energy to grow slowly. The other part with lambs is they need good quality water. If you take a timeline from then if I take a June lambing, and you say, well, when's the average lamb born? And generally 50% of the ewes lamb roughly about day 10 in a June lambing. But it can vary between years, between 8 and 18 days. And that determines the distribution of your lambs within that group. If you're an earlier lammer, you might be lambing, you might have joined for 8 weeks, and the average birthday may be day 25, and so it makes it much harder to meet the criteria of the 10 kilograms, or 95% of all the lambs to be greater than 10 kilograms at when you wean them. If you move down the time, the average time of marking in a recent study that I've completed was about day 51 after lambing has started. In terms of age of the lamb, that's about day 41 average, using this example here. The weight of those lambs is about 17 kilograms. This is for a crossbred, mixed sex crossbred merino terminal sire lamb. If you're talking about merinos in general, it's about 15% less. The live weight would be about 15% less than that at that particular same age. So that's And so at that time, and then you need to wait at least 3 weeks for the marking process to, lambs get over the marking process. If you wait that 3 weeks for these animals, these terminal ones where you're not mulesing, at that stage, the average age would be about day 62. So they're above 8 weeks of age, and 98% of lambs would be above 10 kilograms at that particular point in time. So yes, it's possible to wean lambs then, but in terms of actual time frame from when the lambs are when lambing started, that's about 10 weeks. If you're doing mules, if you mule those lambs, you should add another extra week to that, and so that's roughly 11 weeks that merinos could be considered early weaning. And so there's some other conflicts, if you like, that come into it. We suggest vaccinating and marking those lambs with clostridial disease, cheesy gland, scabby mouth, and that sort of stuff. Generally, the vaccine, the second booster vaccine, given that potentially they're going to be on feed, is going to be 4 weeks later, but you only give them 3 weeks. I don't know how that changed the efficacy of the vaccine, but you know that's one conflict in there. The other, when you do wean, the idea would be to make as homogeneous groups as you can, because that's easier to manage, particularly if they're going into some sort of confinement feeding. And as pointed out, that you should be taking off the tail at a regular basis to sort of manage them separately. When it comes to the worms, this is a result from some of the trials, some of the work I did. Down the bottom here is, one represents lamb marking, 2 is 3 weeks later, and 4 weeks later, 4 weeks later. So that's lamb marking day 51, that's 156 days after the start of lambing there. The two graphs represent one where there was a significant difference in live weight gain in the group that had worm control, worm suppressed versus none, and the green line represents the where there wasn't. But I just wanted to point out that, in other words, worms do take off can take off a considerable amount of live weight gain over time. And remember, these guys are going to have to be in for a period of time to do it. So even at the earliest time, at lamb marking, there is some worms there, and even the amount is may not be that great, and it certainly wouldn't be worth considering drenching. But it's increasing with time, and say if you choose to wean at days 10 weeks after the start of lambing, they have got some worms, so you have to deal with those worms, or within a close time after weaning to deal with those worms, particularly if you're going to feed a high value feed to them. So the other way to do it is to go and collect fecal samples from those lambs, see what they are, and it's collecting poo from the lamb, not from the ewe. This is really important. And if they have a high worm egg count, then you have to give them an effective drench. If they have a low worm egg count, you can maybe hang off for a little time. When I say an effective drench, the main worm that's present in those lambs is the brown stomach worm, and that's the worm that's most resistant to drenches out there. And we're talking about, in most cases, a triple combination drench would be your baseline drench to use on that one. And ideally you would put them onto, if you are going to put them on green feed, put them onto paddock that is have a low worm burden. And otherwise, if you put them on a paddock that's highly contaminated, within 4 weeks they'll have the same level of worms, and they just continue on where they were before. So how do you grow? You want to grow these animals that are lighter weight up to getting to a finished product or a saleable product. And so if you look at, well, what grows a lamb, how much energy they need, and it's about 10.2 megajoules. They need that much, 18 grams of metabolisable protein. And the growth rate 150 really can be higher, but I'm just using that as a figure there. You need about 1,100 kilograms of really good digestible feed out there to achieve that growth rate. If you don't have if you don't get them onto there when the pasture is starting to decline because it's starting to flower and set seed and things like that, and the digestibility is dropping off and the protein's dropping off, you need much more of the protein, much more of the food there. The alternative is confinement feeding, and I've given 2 rates of feeding there that would achieve the growth rates. You can use, if you were, say, using if the lambs were exposed to lupins beforehand, you keep feeding them lupins afterwards, no problems. There is a time after that you could then consider doing a least cost ration and working out what is a cheaper way of feeding, but that would be secondary. That would have to happen after, some period, 2 weeks after the weaning process is finished. You don't want to introduce this additional stress of change of feed, because that could then lead to a reduction in intake. You lose a kilogram here, and as you're trying to keep the lamb growing at 1 kilogram a day, it's minimum. It's very hard. Can be very hard. The other issue is if you're going to use feeders and things like that. These are little tackers. Most of the feeders are designed for adult sheep, and sometimes they just can't get access to these things. So you've got to ensure that they can access the feeders that you're using without restriction. So what I just wanted to look at here was to say, well, I just present some work here. This is growth of merino crossbred lambs on 14 farms from Esperance through to Pingelly, through to Darkin, Kojun up, Manjum up, Albany. It's across the white, and the winter growing season on those farms we got information from, and the winter growing seasons from April to October, and in the first 2 years where it's basically average. The winter grazing season was the long-term average. The growth rates were similar. In 2015, all but 2 were below average. So the average long-term winter growing season was only 82%. The growth rate of those lambs, measured over the same time period, was less. When you start looking at where did the loss of weight occur, in the growth rates of those prime lambs, from lamb marking to 14 weeks after the start of lambing, was not significant between years. It was only after and I presume that's because they had been fed quite well, and the food was between the food and the supplementation, the lamb and the ewe was pretty well adequately met. But once you stop that feeding and rely totally on the food, which is the drier spring, if you want to put it that way, that's when the lamb didn't grow as fast as expected. So the take-home message is that if you are planning to wean earlier, and this is the thing is, when we say earlier, we're talking about most probably, we recommend to wean now at 12, 14 weeks. And most of the producers I dealt with didn't wean until 17 weeks for those terminal sire ones. So when they talk about earlier, they're talking about, I've had some phone calls, they're talking about weaning at 14 weeks. That to them is early. The truth of the matter is others are considering, well, can I wean now, like that timetable I gave you, at 10 weeks? That started getting into, I think the risk, if you go too early, there's too many risks getting it wrong. And what you end up, and if you look at some papers where they compared the weights of animals weaned to 8 weeks versus 14 weeks and measure them later on in time, the 8-week ones, if you don't get it right, will always be lighter at partial senescence, which means you're going to have to feed them more over the summer period to ensure that the survival is adequate. So my message is, yes, you can wean a bit earlier, but it has to be done well. Otherwise, you end up paying later on in summertime.
Thank you, Danny. Any questions for Danny on weaners and weaner health? Down the front here, Graham.
Just out of 2010-11, when we were confining lambs, basically feedlotting to sort of wean a bit earlier, vitamin E seemed pretty critical because they hadn't had that much access to green. And I was sort of talking more northern areas than southern areas. What are your thoughts on that?
Just repeat the question.
Yeah, the role of vitamin E in a feedlot situation. Generally, vitamin E runs down over a 6-week period, and so it tends to be a summer issue in March, April, that type of thing. And what I am suggesting, I didn't mention here that those lambs should get selenium and cobalt, as part of the vaccination part of it and the drenching part of it. So they should have adequate selenium. My guess is if they're going to be long-term in a feedlot, vitamin E a drench with vitamin E would be required. Vitamin E per se, from what I understand, doesn't cause production loss, but it causes muscle damage, and the animals then don't walk to the feedlot to eat as much. So it doesn't cause, it's not related to how it generates energy or anything like that. It's more physical slowing down of the basis. So it wouldn't make good sense if they're going to be in more than 4 weeks in a feedlot to either after the 4th week to start giving vitamin E drenched to them 4 to 6 weeks.
Ashley?
Danny, how about you just go through what weaning might look like for someone who doesn't have any feed on the ground at the moment? So those areas in the northeast where it's just totally bare, what would you say for weaning age, feeding and all that sort of business for those people?
Just repeat it too.
Yeah, in the northeastern areas where there's no green at all, what option? The only option they've got is to wean in a confinement area. If they haven't thought about it way back before marking occurred, the other interesting bit was if you're lambing, most of those guys in the eastern wheat belt, I understand, lamb April, May, and they tend to join over 8 weeks. So they've got quite a spread of lambs and that sort of stuff. And the early lambers tend to take their time to when marking occurs, because they're not constrained by flies and other things like that. The later lambers have to wean before flies, mark before flies become a problem. So unless they wanted to, unless they physically made a decision, if they just kept to form, they might be waiting, they might be under 51 days. So they're not actually going to early wean when they do the marking. That's the rate determining step in this. And because here we are in July, most of them are 10, 12 weeks after the start of lambing, if they haven't considered weaning. The issue is they most probably haven't considered weaning in the past until it dries out in September. So it's...
You say weaning to a confinement, what are they going to do? What are they going to feed them? What sort of rates and all that sort of stuff?
Basically, you would have to feed them. Ideally, you would take the ewes, leave them in the paddock that they are in a paddock that they know. Take the ewes away from that paddock, if you like, rather than put in a new paddock. You're trying to reduce stress at each point in time. Secondly, you would use a feed that they're familiar with for the first 7 days at least, before you consider after weaning, so they continue to eat and do that. You ideally give them the second vaccination, you give them the drench that's required at that stage or within 3 weeks of that point in time. And you're just feeding, and so the only feed that would match their requirements, particularly for protein, would be pellets or lupins. So after that period of time, if they want to switch to a least cost ration, which might be something else, that's that's a different story a little bit later.
So leaving them in the paddock that they were born in for the first
Well,
7 to 10 days until
yeah,
they get
yeah,
used to the
yeah,
situation?
Yeah. But, as I said, a lot of those people, if they're lambed early, they're already at their 10, 12 weeks after the start of lambing. It's actually not early weaning. It's the right time to wean. It's just early for them because they haven't done it in the past.
Do we have any questions from the regions? No? Well, we'll move on. Thank you very much, Danny, for that. I'd like to welcome Norm Sandage to the stage. Norm is from Landgate and he's the Senior Spatial Information Manager?
Remote sensing officer. But
Remote Sensing Officer, so I'm giving him new titles. Norm's going to share with us the latest maps from Landgate and talk a bit more about Pastures from Space Plus and what it can offer farmers. Get me back to here.
Okay, thanks, Mandy, and thanks to the department for the opportunity. Got technical problems?
No, I just got to get your screen.
Hit the right button. Okay. Yeah, I'm Norm Santich from Landgate, and I work on agricultural applications of remote sensing, such as Pastures from Space and others. And so today I'm going to give an overview of where the season's at and how we can predict the future from Pastures from Space, and give an overview on what Pastures from Space actually is. So, last year was a pretty good season, and the first half of July, this is what the situation was in terms of the green feed on offer. So you can see that the purple pixels, well, the legend's over on the right-hand side here, so the purple pixels are where your feed on offer is greater than 1.5 tonne per hectare. The red pixels, which there's not too many of, are less than 50 kilos per hectare, and you can see all the other colours in between. So that was about a year ago. What about last week? That's the situation right there. So this isn't saying that the whole wheat belt's growing annual pastures. This is saying where there are annual pastures on that map, that's what the green feed on offers level is at. And where did all those purple pixels go from the previous slide? So yeah, once again, you can see all those areas in red are growing at less than 50 kilos per hectare, if at all. But down through here where it's the lighter greens, this mouse is pretty hard to use here, is between 100 and 500 kilos per hectare. So that's just comparing first half of July this year with a good season last year. What about historically? So we've got imagery in the archive going back to 2004. So when we look at how this time of year, so in this case it was last week, the first half of July, how does that compare with all the growing seasons going back to 2004 at the same time of year? So the red pixels are saying all other years at that time of year have been greener than this one. The brighter purples are saying none of them have been greener. This was the greenest year. So all this perennial vegetation through here, that's doing really well because of all the good season that we had last year and all the rain that we had earlier on in the year. Whereas the red areas, so particularly Dandaragan, Dalwallinu, Mount Marshall, and down here at Kojonup, West Arthur and Boyup Brook, you can see that they're having the driest season at this time of year since 2004, and maybe even longer, but that's 2004 is as far back as the imagery goes. I'll just wait for the camera to go. Yep. And have we seen this before? I reckon yes. I was looking at this paddock, which is at the Muresk Institute up at Northam, and the black line is the total dry matter production for this year, and you can see all the other years going back to 2004 have been turned on. And I saw the black line and thought, oh, what does that look like? A bit like this one, which is the yellow curve of 2006. And most people remember what a shocking year 2006 was generally. So when I saw that, I got a bit nervous, and I was actually talking to a farmer back in February, March, and says, this is starting to feel like 2006 all over again, maybe even 2015, where you've got that stop-start. But it has actually started raining now, so we'll see what happens and where we go to from here. So what is Pastures from Space? Actually, before I talk about Pastures from Space in general, where was it actually growing last week? So pink is you can either interpret it less than 10 kilos per hectare per day or not at all, 0. But you can see that it's growing along the coastal western fringe here from Mandurah down to Augusta, and around about Albany and Esperance is looking like it's having a not too bad a season. So this sort of information has been used in the past, like in bad years of 2006 and 2010, for farmers to actually get on the phone, right, look up where it's actually growing, sell the sheep there, or actually lease a property or buy a property and move the sheep onto them. And I've had a fair few farmers telling me using that they've been able to sleep at night during a bad season, like especially in 2015. So what is Pastures from Space? For me, it's all about where is the grass growing, how much grass is growing in each paddock, how quickly is it growing at the moment, and how much has it grown in the past. It was the model was developed by the CSIRO back about 15, 20 years ago. The Ag Department went out into the actual paddocks, did all the ground truthing, all the cuts, calibrated and validated the model, and Langate coordinate the satellite imagery download, getting the climate data in from the Bureau, getting the producer paddock maps in, and integrating all of it for what we're about to see now. So for the general public, they've got two options. They can go onto our demonstration website. In fact, I'll just go back to that. Over here, there's a View Our Demo farm. So if people aren't sure about how to use the technology, it's an online tool. They can actually click on this View Our Demo farm. That'll take them to the Muresk Institute. And from there, they can get access to a lot of freely available data. So they can turn on the pasture growth rate imagery, as you saw in the previous slide. They can have a look at the greenness as measured from satellite. They can zoom out, pan across to their property of interest, zoom in, and have a look at what's going on. If they're lucky enough to live around the Muresk Institute, and I didn't say this, they can actually turn on the high resolution imagery and have a look at what's actually happening within a paddock. And I'll get to that in a bit. So as I said, it's a pretty simple online tool, so pfs.landgate.wa.gov.au. And so yeah, if they want more information specific to their individual paddocks, they can actually subscribe to a service, digitise each paddock of interest into the system. So it'll cost them $99 as a setup fee. That'll get their historical data processed, their maps online and everything up and going. And then depending on how much area they've actually digitised all up, you can see the cost structure. So 0 to 500 hectares is $200 a year. 500 to 1,500 hectares is $410. Or they can pay more for the high resolution imagery option. So once they've got their paddocks into the system, I back process the historical data, and then for every paddock for every week going back to 2004, we tell them what the pasture growth rate is, what the feed on offer is, what the NDVI is. And NDVI is a term that you'll hear a bit. Pretty much it's how we manipulate the satellite imagery to highlight how green is it on the ground. So 20 is essentially a bare paddock, 80 is a fully green cereal crop. So over here on the left you can see every paddock that they've got in the system is summarised, so you can sort it whether it be alphabetically in terms of which paddock's growing the fastest, which one's got the highest or lowest amount of food, or which one's changing the most. For every paddock there's also a graphing tool or and also a stocking rate calculator. So you can see that each paddock in the system for the week of choice is coloured up according to its pasture growth rate. So these brighter pink purples look to me to be about 70 to 85 kilos per hectare, whereas the darker are growing at about 65 kilos per hectare, plus or minus about 5. So they also get access to the MODIS, the pasture growth rate image, so they can see the variation across the landscape, and they can zoom out to a continental level to see what's happening, as I showed before. One thing to note, these pixels are 250 metre by 250 metre square, so about 6¼ hectares. So yes, it's coarse, but the satellite goes over once or twice a day, so we actually update the information every week. And because we're able to do that, we can get some pretty good historical time traces. So you can see where the season's at, where it's heading, and how it compares. We also generate the green feed on offer per paddock. So once again, the purple paddocks are greater than 1.5 tonne per hectare. The blue is between 1,000 and 1,500 kilos per hectare. And we also show the NDVI per paddock So how green is the paddock? How green does it look from space? Now, I never really saw the value in supplying this information. 20, yeah, it's bare, 80, it's really green, 62, what does that mean? Well, the MLA are actually introducing an app in September in collaboration with the University of New England. So they've actually gone out and done the pasture cuts for each individual species. So you'll be able to say, right, I'm growing fescue or capeweed or clover or ryegrass or phalaris or whatever, put in the NDVI for that pasture species, and it will tell you what the feed on offer is. Because when the Ag Department went out and did all the ground truthing, it was only for species specific to WA at the time, so stuff like capeweed, clover, ryegrass. But over east they grow a lot more cold tolerant pasture species. So now with the MLA University of New England app, it'll just broaden the range of what the feed on offer and the NDVI offer. And you can also see the Modus NDVI greenness image. So how green is it? How does it vary across the landscape? You can zoom in, zoom out again to the continental scale. So I mentioned we've also got the charting tool. So for every paddock we offer, up the top you can see the pasture growth rate, the feed on offer, the NDVI, the total dry matter production and the rainfall according to the Bureau of Meteorology. So this slide's got every year turned on, and you can see those years that have had a pretty decent autumn. It slows down a bit as you come into winter, and then the spring really makes a difference. So a booming spring or an early failing spring, depending on the year. It's also graphs up the NDVI, so how green is it? So you can see that, during summer, not very green at all, and then as the season breaks, you can see those curves really pick up. So you can see the early breaking seasons or the later breaking seasons. Now, most farmers that I talk to, this is where they're getting the real value and the real power from Pastures from Space now. So looking at where the season is at the moment and how does that compare? So last year, in 2016, I gave this presentation back in April, and we could see that for this particular paddock, and you've got to remember that this data is specific to a paddock, so it's not representative of the whole state, it's just specific to the paddock. So for this particular paddock in Arthur River, we could see that it was paralleling 2008, and as you can see, 2008 ended up a 10-tonne season. 2006 wasn't growing as quickly, so eyeballing it, we said, it looks like it's going to level out at about 9 tonne, and sure enough, where's that tracking? It grew just over 9 tonne. So knowing that, the farmer was able to work out, right, what's the carrying capacity for that paddock back in April? So that's a pretty powerful piece of information right there. This season, as you can see, started off early, flatlined to nothing, and then May started off again. So we'll see where that tracks relative to the other years. I mentioned the high resolution imagery. So NASA back in 2013 launched the Landsat 8 satellite. Now this one's got 30 megapixels. So as you can see, you can start to see what's really happening inside a paddock. So the area of interest to note is this paddock here. So you can see that on the western part of it, it's growing not too badly according to the legend, whereas the eastern part, it's pretty well struggling. Now this farmer saw this, worked out what is the area of that part of the paddock that's actually struggling, went in and put in Flexi-N, and then 16 days later when the next image came out, you can really see the improvement that just fertilising that part of the paddock made. And just by doing that alone, he saved himself $400, and he was so excited he rang me to tell me about it. He's also using this sort of data to see where are the sheep grazing within a paddock and where are they leaving alone, and then once he moves them off, what parts of the paddock are recovering quicker and which parts are struggling. You can also zoom out to see more of a landscape, check out how your neighbours are doing, and if you can see that their wheat crop's doing a lot better, you can just go and ask them and say, hey, what are you doing differently? I'm looking at the imagery and it's looking much better than what I'm doing. Got any advice? So I've taken this higher resolution imagery and also produced the pasture growth rate information. So you can see the variability across the paddock and also the green feed on offer. Now I mentioned it, yep.
How do you know where the sheep are grazing?
Well, he's looking at the before and after. So this is where the paddock sits at the moment, and then you can see the variability. Once the sheep start grazing, he can see what parts of the greenness are dropping and which are either going up or staying the same. So just by looking at the change in the imagery. So in the future, I'm hoping that we'll actually have a slider where you can fade one image out over the other and actually see the differences, between the 16 days, assuming you get 2 consecutive cloud-free shots. So we've also got the stocking rate calculator, and this is based on the MLA's one, but the difference with our one is you can click on an individual paddock and it will bring in what's the current pasture growth rate and the current feed on offer. So it takes the guesswork out of it, and all you really need to do is either specify, right, what are you grazing, what do you want to graze down to, and either how long are you going to graze the paddock for with a set number, well, with a calculated number of stock, or how long can I graze a paddock for with a given number of stock. So it's got the 2 scenarios there, and I think I'm about out of time. Except for questions.
Thanks, Norm. Any questions here in the room to start with? That Robin Jacob again.
How many farmers are on the system now, using?
When we launched this back in 2 years ago at Wagen, we had 7. We've now got 128 signed up, and that's across the whole country. In fact, we're actually getting more subscribers over in the eastern states than we are in WA.
Are there any questions out in the regions? I think Norm's shown us some very interesting maps there, and I did hear the intake of breath on the second map. But I think the real exciting thing is that Pastures from Space has really evolved in providing a lot more capacity for people to work out how to manage their pastures and what they're getting from their pastures. So it's really quite exciting, and I think we should start to see that really grow, and with that high res imagery.
Yep.
I think that's really important.
There's now 2 satellites up there with 10 megapixels, and I've got most of that back processed across the whole agriculture zone on the continent. So
That's a lot of data.
Yep. So yeah, it will continue to evolve. So watch this space.
Would you like to join me in thanking Norm for his presentation? I'd like to introduce myself. I'm just going to give a short presentation, a little bit more on nutrition and feed budgeting, but also I thought I'd just quickly cover a selection of ewes and which one of those ewes within the groups that you've chosen to retain that you might choose. We've heard a little bit already this morning, so I won't labour the point, but I think it's just useful to go over some of those key things. So just remembering about energy, and we've heard about energy is king. That's what we need. But energy in lactation, it increases and peaks at about 3 weeks into lactation. So once the ewes had the lamb, she's building up and her energy requirement, so she can build up her milk, and then it starts to taper off. And the other thing to remember is twinning ewes require about 30% more than a single bearing ewe, and that this year, with the reported number of lambs, a lot of those lambs are going to be twins this year. We're hearing 50 to 60% twinning rates were scanned earlier in the year. So there are a lot of ewes carrying twins, and they have that extra burden. Once the lambs are weaned, the ewes' requirements drop down to about that 8.5, depending on her frame size and her condition. So it's really important. That's a big shift in her requirement, but we need to focus on her and getting her back into condition for the next season. And as you've heard from John, there's profit to be made from doing that. And also, if you are looking at confinement, remember it's about a 20% saving because those animals aren't racing around trying to find green pick in the paddock and using up energy that way. Just tried to capture a little bit there on maintaining a U in score 2 on low pasture, about 7 megajoules per day she needs, and depending on the feed source, if it's oats at 10 megajoules a kilo, you're looking at about 700 grams per day. This is the total diet, or about 600 grams of a 12 megajoule feed like barley, and it'll be a bit less for lupins. And I'm assuming the lupin price is climbing after this number of talks section. If you're in confinement, you're looking around that 6 megajoule per day. But we do need to know what she's getting from the paddock, and remembering to leave some feed in the paddock over spring so that you're protecting your land surfaces as well. That's particularly important. Now, I just want to quickly show you a graph, and this is taken from a tool that we have online at the department site, and some of you may not have seen it, so I won't labour the content, but just to show you what we can get from that. So it's a sheep feed calculator, and the address is down the bottom there, so if you search on annual feed budget for sheep on the department site, that will come up. This tool gives you an opportunity to choose the class of sheep. If it's used when they're pregnant or when they were joined, it allows you to select a default value for the pasture availability, or you can put that in and choose your feed that you want to use. Now, as you can see on the my mouse has disappeared on the graph. There's the blue line is the requirement for the animal, and at this stage I've got a ewe in there lambing in June, so you can see her increase in energy required over the year. The very light green fade in the background is the poor pasture I've put in for this year, and these green bars really show you the amount of barley, which is the feed I selected, to be fed per month, and on this side it'll give you a monthly cost, and when you use the calculator it'll present that in a table as well, and it'll give you a per head per day and a total for the year. So it's just a really good way to get that snapshot of planning what sort of feed you're going to require. You can do weaners in there as well. Won't touch too much on the weaner requirements because we've talked a little bit about that, but of course as the animal grows and becomes larger, they have a higher energy requirement, and if you want them to grow faster, of course they have a higher energy requirement. But with weaners, it's not just about energy, as we've heard, it's about protein as well. You can feed them as much energy as you like, but if protein's limited, they won't achieve the growth rate. And the converse is true. If you feed them as much protein as you can get into them, but the energy's not there, they still won't grow. So for weaners, it's about matching protein and energy so they can grow. This slide just shows, I've just taken a diet like, say for example, barley, 11 megajoules per kilo. The feed stuff is 11 megajoules per kilo, so that's the diet. And as you can see on here that we've got growth rates along here and crude protein along the bottom row. If you come to crude protein of 8, which is too low for weaners, it was more like a dry ewe, you can see it doesn't matter if you feed them 1.1 kilos a day or 0.9 kilos a day or 0.7 kilos a day, you're going to get about the same growth rate because it's protein that's limiting. Once you get up over the 12-13 level, then you will actually be able to utilise the energy that's in there, and it'll be energy limiting. This graph was some work that came out of the Lifetime Wool project and a couple of others as well, and it talks about something that we hear a lot, which is if weaners aren't growing, they're dying. So to maintain a weaner, in effect, is to have them growing at a minimum of about 30 grams per head per day, about a kilo a month. If they're not growing at all, they're not coping. So it's about growth. But coming back to weaning weight and growth rate, this slide shows that if you're going to wean very light animals, so 20% of their mature weight, so about 10 kilos. If you're weaning at 10 kilos, the weaner's survival is quite low if you're only letting them grow at about half a kilo a month. That's very low growth rate. If you want to boost their survival, it's about having them growing faster. So as long as they're growing faster, you can lift their survival if you're having to wean them at a very low weight. However, once you're up at about 50% of their adult weight, so 25, 30 kilos, then growth rate post-weaning isn't so important because they've already done a lot of that preliminary growth which has got them on the path. So just something to remember, the earlier you wean them, the much more important the growth rate is post-weaning for survival. We talked a little bit about least cost rations, and we do have a calculator, a feed cost calculator on the Ag Department site as well. Hopefully this will come up. And it'll allow you to choose one feed, it'll put in some default values, put in your on-farm cost, and it'll convert it to cents per megajoule or the amount of protein. The other thing it allows you to do is choose a number of different feeds and work out a least cost ration. Right. It's not going to bring it up, sorry. So one of the things with lupins, and we've heard about the value of lupins, if you have a limited supply of lupins, and we know that lupins are in the 30% realm for protein, we don't actually need 30% protein. You can add other feedstuffs to still have your 15-16% protein, but so it's effectively extending the life of your lupins. This calculator gives you an opportunity to choose something, choose your feed, put in a cost per farm. Nope, sorry. Let's put in 350. I click on that, it'll oops, sorry. It'll give you some default figures here, and at that price, it's saying it's about 3 megajoules per kilo. Sorry, 3 cents per megajoule as fed. And your other option is to put in another feed. So it's a bit awkward. So if we choose something like barley, cost per farm, I'll go with 250 just to make it easier, and you can see it's put in some default figures, and it's 2 cents a megajoule as fed. The calculator also allows you now to change the proportion of lupins and barley, those two feeds that you've put in. If you can see down here, it's now at 20% lupins, 80% barley. Your protein as fed is 14%. You may go, well, I actually want a bit more than that, so I'll move the slider to 15, so it gets to protein as 15%, and you can see it's 25% lupins to 75 barley. But we're looking at a feed cost of about 2 cents, 2 cents a megajoule. So that's just another tool that's on the website that may be of useful. Just want to very quickly go through which ewes to keep, and we talked about keeping the ewes, those 2.5, 3.5, was a class that John and Ashley identified as key because they've got reproductive and production potential for longer, but they're also a proven performer at that point. Just to have a look at this graph here, you can see at about year 4.5, that's when they reach their peak of reproduction, and it tails off a little bit from there. But it is still usually higher than their reproduction as a maiden. Many of you will have seen this slide many times before, but it's still a really key one to remember. And last season showed everybody that, I think, as ewe condition score at joining increases, you'll get a decrease in dry ewes and an increase in twinning ewes. And that's the thing with merinos. You can't go, right, I want to get them in good nick so I have less dries, but I want them all to be single. Sorry, doesn't happen. You're going to get more twinning ewes. So you just need to be prepared. When they're in good condition, you're going to have more twinning ewes, so learn how to manage them. The other thing that a lot of people do, and there's some really good opportunities, is that pregnancy scanning, and I'm talking pregnancy scanning for multiples, not pregnancy scanning for wet and dry. Pregnancy scanning for multiples costs a little bit more per head to scan. However, don't forget, you're still bringing in all the other costs are the same. So the actual extra cost for multiple scanning is really quite low, but the benefit is you actually get some key information. You get the information of what the potential of the flock is. You can also use it to cull animals who aren't performing. The other part of information is wet and drying, either at marking or if you're pretty good at weaning. And this is some data from New South Wales flocks. So someone did comment that we have modern merinos here. They might be a little different, but I'll leave that to you. But I think one of the key things is that this is the first two lambings along the bottom. So this is their early life reproduction. This is the lambs weaned per ewe joined for their later years of reproduction. So you can see if there's no successful pregnancies for the first 2 years, that ewe is likely to produce only one lamb in the rest of her joinings later in life. Dry once and lost once. She's had one successful pregnancy. Well, she's had one pregnancy but lost it. There's quite a big jump for her later in life. So she's been unlucky perhaps once, but she's not barren. She's had a lamb. And then it continues through to 2 successful pregnancies, raising at least one lamb in each of those pregnancies. So there is a reason to cull on wet and dry, but as John I think would tell you, that if you're going to cull on wet and dry in the first year, which is a lot less accurate than this, then if you're going to cull heavily on that, what are you going to replace them with in your ewe flock? It's probably going to be maidens who you also don't know how they perform. So having 2 years reproduction data is much better. And wool production is the other one that you might like to consider when you're making culling decisions. The solid line is the change in fibre diameter, so it increases from a hogget through to about 6 years old and then drops off a little bit. And as you can see, clean fleece weight peaks at around the 3 years old and gradually drops off as well. So that might be some of the influence. And there's just some key points there, but it's an opportunity at weaning is to ensure that you take off the thinner ewes so you can preferentially feed them. And don't forget, those thinner ewes are probably twin-bearing ewes anyway, so you want to give them the best chance to get pregnant. And I'll leave it there. So has anyone got any questions on that? Any decisions, anything out in the regions?
Mandy, John Blake, I have 2 questions if I may.
Yep.
One is, will these slides be circulated to participants?
Yes, we're hoping that we'll have some PDF versions of presentations so that people can have another look at that, because I know sometimes, particularly in the regions, it's hard to see those, and we are recording the session as well.
Thanks, Mandy. And the second question was, we like the example plan Ashley had for autumn, and we wonder whether you or Ashley have got a example plan as we run into spring with the tipping points, the tipping point approach.
So you're asking for it's like the exit strategy approach, but
Yeah.
done in spring. Ashley, have you whipped that one up?
No, I can.
Nobody can, he says, and I think a lot of what he presented this morning was part of that plan, and there's so many options there, but those sorts of planning, that sort of planning is an individual enterprise, I imagine, but example plan you feel would be useful for people to get their heads around what that might be.
John's got Ed there. Ed can do it for him.
Ashley said, John, you've got Ed next to him. Ed can do one for you.
Thanks, I'll get on to Ed.
Okay, thank you. We've got the last two sessions are really important sessions, and that's really about the people. And that people should really not be underestimated, and the role in all this. And as Ashley started the day talking about, we need clear decision making and rational decision making, and to be able to do that, we need to be in a good place to do that. So I'd like to welcome Terry up the stage here, and I'll get your presentation up for you.
Still morning. Good morning, everyone. Just a little handout. I will explain that in a minute too. So, yeah, look, Regional Men's Health, we're a Raw Tees for Regions funded program. We're based out of Northern, but we cover the whole state. Just quickly on our vision, we are, I suppose, unashamedly about improving blokes and men's well-being, but in doing that too, we really like to recognise the important roles ladies play, obviously the specific health issues they need to be aware of and look out for themselves, but also acknowledging the important roles they play not only in our family lives, our business lives and communities, and certainly in agriculture, keeping the household running, bringing in off-farm income, volunteering at the local school and working in the footy club. So really important role, and also that really important, quite often conduit for blokes to seek help. Now, not being politically incorrect, some blokes do say or refer to that as nagging. It's interesting they never actually say that when the lady's around, but it is that primary caring role that ladies are really vital in encouraging blokes to seek some help. The three, I suppose, the areas our work could be broken into is education sessions all around the state. Fast Track Pit Stop is a health awareness tool. We have a strong relationship, obviously, with the department, it being in your shed at Newdigate and Darren, but we're just heading on a road trip up to a whole lot of mining expos and shows up in the north. So anywhere from footy clubs to workplaces, wherever we're requested, and that's a basic health awareness check we sit down and do with guys. And then also this advocacy, we're not a mental health or specific counselling service, but we talk to guys in all ages and stages, different points of decision making, dealing with distress and sort of helping them navigate some of those challenges and issues they're dealing with. And this is really important part too, when people are in distress and are in a tough place, not thinking clearly, sometimes the obvious option for help is a lot harder. So pointing guys in that right direction and giving permission to seek help is pretty important. And as I said, we do cover around the whole state, so and we're a mobile unit. Just to mention, I suppose when we talk about health and wellbeing, we've got to take a holistic approach and put the context of issues. And I suppose I'll mention a bit about the season and that at the moment. But obviously, we've got our physical health to look after. We'll talk a little bit about mental health today and the impacts of stress and distress on our mental wellbeing. But we just like to mention up front too the importance of an underlying foundation for our health, this social aspect of social, spiritual wellbeing. I'm not here to preach. For some people, religion is an important part of that, but for a lot of guys, it's not through the religious aspect, but it's about being comfortable in our skin, sense of self, sense of belonging, and being connected in some context to our families, our workplaces, our environment, and having some passions and interests to fall back on. And we think if we have a strong sense in that area, those other mental and physical sort of, when they come up, we're a bit better prepared to deal with them. Just like to mention also, we think it is important to empower people to make positive lifestyle choices. The difficult thing in life is choice and making decisions quite often, but just reinforcing the biggest impact on our day-to-day health and well-being are the decisions we make around diet, exercise, what we put into our bodies. Maybe sometimes distresses and things out of our control inhibit our choice making, but also getting people to have a think a bit about the environment they work in. You know, what's affecting them on a day-to-day basis. You know, health and safety issues. You know, something as simple as skin cancer, working on the outdoors. So being a bit aware of our environment. Definitely, I think we're getting more and more aware of, with genetics and research into certain illnesses and diseases, and we now know with certain clinically diagnosed mental illness, there is a strong genetic or what we call a vulnerability, predisposition that can be there dormant and be triggered by choices or environmental stresses and whatnot. Then also for people in regional areas, we all know lack of not only specialist health services, but just general doctors, visiting nurses, so the tyranny of distance, working in isolation, all that's going to impact on health and wellbeing as well. So just to mention, wellbeing in challenging times, it is first and foremost looking after ourselves. We talk about quite often all the P's in business and agriculture: profit, performance, production, process is all very important. But as Mandy said, if we're not in a good, healthy, functioning headspace ourselves, it's harder to make decisions that will bring benefit in those other areas. The last 7 days I've been from Cunderdin out to Hyden, across to Darkin, and I just got back from Ben Cubban last night, and people in varying stages of whether from cropping, pasture, livestock management. But a couple of the most serious conversations I had with people were those other people issues going on, whether it was a health issue, underlying progression issues, the conflict, relationship. It's almost like those effects of the seasonal issues bring those other issues up to the surface, almost like the hair that breaks the camel's back. And then I'll just finish on a little bit about primary care and looking out for each other. Quite often we do sort of notice with guys, we do know what the issues are, but we don't want to show ourselves as the only one with a problem. And sometimes it can be a little bit like this: when you're in deep shit, say nothing and try to look like you know what you're doing. And this little fox here is, I suppose, atypical of a bloke who's withdrawn, gone into his shell and just putting up that brave face. And just to, I suppose, help differentiate the difference between normalising having a valid reaction to difficult times, which I think we've got to normalise, versus when something is becoming a bit more sinister or on the clinical diagnosis side of things. We just have this shocky sheet that we do with a couple of thousand guys a year. It's not about diagnosing or assessing, not only for guys in the farming, but also in the attached agribusiness industry, the pressures involved of working with people in distress. So those little 10 questions there are what we can look out for in others as well. So changes away from our normal. And it is about marking on a scale of 1 to 5 where we're at. And then, ones, if we're ticking 1, 2s and 3s, obviously that's quite normal. The 4s and 5s, we have to go back and ask the question, what's causing me to feel this way? We do a lot of talking through each question to identify what's causing it. Is it just a normal stress as a result of what's happening at the moment, or is there other things going on? And then what can we do about it to help address? And quite often that is looking about, that circle of influence. What's in my control? What can I manage? What do I have control over versus those uncontrollables? So just to sort of put that in a bit of context, we've got to focus, I suppose, on being well and staying well, and we all deal with a whole lot of different stresses in this situation, from people in rural communities, the issues around education, access to service, just the cost of doing business, farm progression. It is tough and it is difficult, but that's not to say when we come across these life crises in our lives, whether it's a relationship breakdown, a severe health issue. I'm talking to a guy the other night with just some really full-on caring issues, and lack of support, with caring. We can float in between these two areas. It doesn't mean we have a full diagnosed mental illness. And talking to probably only, mental illness and the way our brain works is pretty complex, but we just say there's 2 ways we can get to this place. One is being born with that genetic vulnerability, the chemical imbalance, or the second way is quite often spending too long in this space of situational distress. So we know stress is normal. When things are prolonged, ongoing, we can become distressed, dysfunctional. The longer we stay in there's going to be changes, that chemical balance in our body, and it can affect us. So What can we do to manage our distress and well-being? We talk to guys about identifying their mates, not only in the tough times, but in the good times, who they can go to disclose things. And the 3 categories of mates quite often blokes have is if we're lucky enough to have a good woman in our life, a partner, a peer, someone we've grown up with for a long time and can go to and trust. And then the third one's that mentor category, someone who's older than us, and we go to for that lived experience and knowledge. Programming time out from work and normalising the problem, and that's where this, our catchphrase of talking to a mate, some people question quite often, what's that all about? Having that someone that we can bounce ideas off. It's not about getting the answers or solving the problem, but making sense of it in our own head. I've got a few technical issues happening here. Be prepared to talk about things that cause us personal pain and distress. Watching out for some of those harmful behaviours in those difficult times. We're not out there saying guys can't have a drink and a beer. The last 6 events I've gone to in communities have been based around a social occasion, a barbecue, a beer, a game of golf. But, just looking out for that, drinking can be habitual. Is it in excess? And then how's it affecting our mood and well-being as well? Maintaining social opportunities, maintaining physical health, just encouraging guys to make sure they're on top of their health, getting a checkup. And when we are feeling shitty, quite often going to the doctor and getting some bloods done first and ruling out some of the biological factors can be important. Then we can work on maybe what's happening in the head. Now this one here, you tell someone who's dealing with livestock management issues, animal welfare or weaning to go and take a holiday, they're going to tell you to get stuffed and laugh at you. But it is about sometimes just getting away and taking a break. And I don't know anyone who can just go 24/7. Some guys probably reckon they can, but at what cost? Their own health and well-being, what the wife wants. I'm sure she would appreciate a bit of a break or getting away. And it's, not going for a massive holiday, but going to that little special spot on the farm. We've all got our little weekend getaways, and then maintaining those social opportunities, going for a game of bowls, a hit of golf, getting to the local footy game and staying connected. Because we do notice when things aren't going too well for people, one of the first things we can do is withdraw. Yep. So that's why we do focus on this aspect of primary care and not taking away just that unbelievable amount of resilience in rural and regional towns, and we've all seen it, but primary care is ordinary people looking out for their mates. The health system sometimes promotes themselves as primary care, but at the end of the day they are secondary because they're not going to come to us. We need to be able to get people to them and access them. So that's just a bit of research around helping people just through listening and being that primary carer. Obviously, it may not be a cuppa, it may be having a beer. Obviously, we've got to be careful who we hug and where we put where you put your hands. But talking to someone, listening, and just supporting them. So dealing with people under stress, as I said before, it's not only dealing with primary producers, but people in the attached agri-business, in sales, banking, the local shop, the service, all feel the pressure, and quite often people in sales are getting it from both ways, from top down, from their services, selling products, pushing products, finances, but then also from the bottom, from the farmers, they're sort of copying their side of things as well. So you can be the man in the middle and a tough space to be in as well. So look, we've got to always remember who owns the problem. When we are in that space and people are disclosing some of those things to us, we've got to put our own personal beliefs and values down sometimes and just listen and connect in a basic way. It's not about fixing things and coming up with answers quite often, but validating and acknowledging someone's situation. We all have our own personal and lived experiences that we can draw upon, but some of that stuff comes a bit later on. Look, been in conversations with people in that industry. I've had some pretty scary things said to them, around, my farmer's saying I might as well go and shoot my sheep and then myself, what's it all worth? And sort of then not maybe acknowledge that and walking off and then stewing and wondering, well, should I have said this, said that? So it's always, I think, good to follow your guts, and if someone does throw something like that down them, back at them, are you really thinking of doing that? Or, have you thought about these people to talk to, and giving permission to seek professional help if it's outside our comfort zone. So all pretty simple stuff. Sure, if there's any questions, fire away, but I'll be around. And we we're out there in the regions trying to just encourage some of these conversations and encourage people to take action if not already doing so. Thanks for your time.
We've just got Chris on the line. He's just going to very quickly give us the last little bit of his update. So thank you very much for saying that.
Thanks, Mandy. And I'll just hint to you when you need to change the slides. For those who don't know, the RFCS has been operating in WA for nearly 20 years now, and nearly 10 years under the current grant holder, and I guess we're a little bit different beast than what we were those many years ago. Fully funded, so mainly federal, a little bit of state funding for primary producers and eligible rural businesses, and really to assist people to deal with the critical issues, clarify their business situation, the risks around it. And I guess Ashley made the mention around about stress, and stress does some pretty terrible things to a normally clear decision-making process. And I guess part of our job, is not to wipe the windscreen for them. Wipe the windscreen for them so they can see out, not for us to see out to tell them what we can see. It's about what they can see, to try and de-stress some of their environment so they can actually make some really good decisions. Often we do find, especially with new clients, when we do meet them, one bad decision, if you look through the history of it, one bad decision has often followed another, and there's a sense of entrapment and complexity and confusion and procrastination, and Ashley also made a reference to that when you get into that state, that the wheels fall off pretty quickly. So to create some space so they can actually make some good decisions, but not just business decisions, and as much as we spend a lot of time on business and financials and budgets, but also holistic ones. They integrate the family ones, of the future, the goals, of the values, the emotional connections, the wants and desires, and the risks to all of that, because it's the whole gamut, not just about the business. And so it's about supporting and empowering them to make the best decision going forward and to come to terms with their situation. And that's really, really important. They have to come to terms with it, where they're at, before they can actually move forward and create some of the solutions for themselves. So next slide, please, Mandy. So I guess a fresh set of eyes, which often is all that's needed, just a different perspective, so they can actually start digging through their own toolbox to find the solutions they need to, rather than hand them on a plate. And uses a pretty powerful business planning system out of Harvard. Next slide, please. So just briefly, there's 10 of us in the state. Obviously, fairly mobile, mostly mobile, and have a broad experience level and skill base, ex-bankers, ex-consultants, accountants, and all with fairly solid financial counselling experience, but also a lot of experience in farming. I think most of us either continue to farm in some way, shape or form, or some of the wives of farmers, or have farmed in the past. So we can certainly empathise through our own experiences, some of the things that many of our clients are going through, and in particular, like year like this, when you're feeding sheep, it is pretty demoralising. The continual reminder every day that hungry sheep, mismothering the ewes, I had a new client the other day who basically realised that at the end of the day, he does not have enough cash to feed his sheep. And he's got no more cash left in the system. The bank won't approve any more finance, and he's just locked in a situation where he's got conditions scored 2.5 years, and they're not worth a cracker really. And he tried to get back into sheep to de-risk his business because he'd gone all cropping, and that was pretty disastrous for him too. So again, a lot of complexity and trying to find some solutions out of that. Next slide, please. Working with a whole gamut of agricultural and rural ag businesses across the state.
Next slide, please. Yep, so just a reminder, the holistic business understanding and planning, trying to, first of all, calm a situation, deal with the critical issues so they can actually start seeing some of the solutions, reducing the stress, and allows them to focus on what's really, really important. And from there, mix with all the finances and start making really good decisions going forward, identify the clear pathways to become more informed, more resilient and more confident and able in making some really good decisions going forward. And those decisions may include re-establishing in farming, refocusing their farm business. It may include for some actually getting out of agriculture, and that's, I guess, if that's the case, and hopefully not, but if that's the case, at least wise they're making the right decisions around those choices, not leaving feeling a little bit bitter because they felt they had to, or inadvertently staying where they haven't got a lot of choices or options left by the time they actually have to make that decision. So that's, I guess, the role we play in helping to facilitate that process. Next slide. Yep. And of course, dealing with the banks and creditors is obviously a fairly key role in that, because that tends to be a stressful part of the farm management process. Even though they never seem to be as bad as what some may make them out to be with the bankers and financiers, but it certainly helps build that relationship and the client's understanding around their business, so that the banker can have some more confidence in being able to support that person. So I guess that's us. I guess the only words I'd have to the agribusiness people in all the rooms and centres across the state in this forum is that please, I guess if you do come across anybody that is in that vulnerable space and is not making terribly great decisions or any decisions at all, and a little bit trapped and blocked, then sometimes that fresh set of eyes from us is all that's needed to get some of that those creative juices going, so they can actually start making some good decisions going forward. Obviously, as I said, we're fully funded, so it's no cost and everything's confidential. So I think that's it from me. Mandy, thanks.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks for getting back on the line. And we also have this recorded so that as people view the video later, they'll see your full presentation.
Great, good, thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you so much to the speakers and the quality of information that we've heard today. It's certainly been excellent. Thank you to Mel Dowling for doing all the organising and keeping everyone in the right place at the right time and getting people at the right place at the right time. Safe travels, and we may talk again later in the season. So thank you very much.